I was having a conversation recently with a friend of mine, and he likes to make the point that there is no such thing as geopolitical justice. There is really no such thing, perhaps, as maybe justice more broadly. And that for leftists to kind of like seek justice, especially in the kind of geopolitical scale in terms of land acquisition and other questions, he finds that to be very counterproductive. My take on his position, it was always, well, it's very easy for you to say that, right? Because you are, on the one hand, a Jewish person, and on the other hand, you take positions on the Israel-Palestine conflict that are just kind of, outside of the international consensus. So it's all well and good to conceptually just have this idea in your head that there is no such thing as geopolitical justice. But why are you really saying that? Are you saying that because truly there is no such thing as geopolitical justice? Or are you simply trying to, kick the can down the road in terms of finding a solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict? And my position is it's the latter, right? Usually, when people talk about things like there's no such thing as justice and we shouldn't even try, usually it's people that have an ideological bias, people that maybe benefit in some way from the status quo, or just emotionally they don't want to budge. And the reason why I say this is, for someone who takes a position in Israel and Palestine anywhere outside of the international consensus, for you to say there is no such thing as geopolitical justice implies, right, and the Israelis are the ones that benefited most from this geopolitical justice, right? Which is why I subtitled this, or is there such a thing as geopolitical justice? There is such a thing, and just the history of the conflict shows that there is a side that benefited tremendously from the international consensus. There is a side that absolutely, went really hard on trying to frame the formation of Israel through international consensus, right? This is what differentiates the kind of political Zionists that started with names like Theodor Herzl, versus the kind of like pre-Herzl, let's just kind of settle this area, let's find a way to live amidst this community. Herzl was much more interested in a political solution that had the entire kind of international community behind it. He was seeking exactly what I'm talking about, which is geopolitical justice, right? So for anyone to now pretend that that's not the case, I mean, it's just an ahistorical reading of how the international consensus worked to actually form Israel in the first place. Okay, so that's the first point, right? I'm already giving you like my answer, right? Is there such a thing as geopolitical justice? And the answer is yes. The point of this part of the stream, and I said I don't want to time it too much, but maybe this is going to take at least 1 hour, probably two, if not maybe a little bit longer. This entire segment of the stream will be dedicated to just going through the evidence to prove that there is geopolitical justice, that Jews did in fact acquire this, right, due to the Holocaust, due to a millennia of pogroms that they wanted to escape. And I'm going to show all the evidence that will kind of I think make my case. The other part of it is just the title here, right? Roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict. I don't find Israel and Palestine to be as complicated as it's made out to be. The first person that I heard making this insight was Norman Finkelstein, right? He says all the time, this isn't really a complicated issue. Hopefully, I will seek to make it even less complicated, perhaps, than maybe he would even give credit for that. So let's just go through this piece by piece. I want to first start with this question of what the Israel-Palestine conflict is not, right? Because before we even get to all this other stuff, like, I want people to just be aware of kind of like my broader outlines of my thinking here. So first of all, the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's not extremely complicated, right? And it's definitely not too complicated to discuss. This, like, I remember growing up, right? I grew up with, like, around, like, a lot of Jews, even, like, liberal Jews. And I would often, get into like debates with them about Israel Palestine because, as some of you might be aware, maybe this isn't the case anywhere else in the world, but in America, American Jews, because of the kind of alliances that the United States ultimately came to forge after the 1967 war with Israel. Like political opinion making, it literally starts from the top, right? It's not this like fucking like median voter theory where you have two political parties that are courting like the middle ground vote, right? What does the average voter look like? That's not really what happens. What happens is these ideas, right, of what policy ought to be, what the political discussion ought to be. This really comes from the very top, right, and it's handed down. After 1967, it became clear that Israel could be a strong geopolitical ally to the United States. Prior to the 1960s, Israel was not really on anyone's radar. American Jews mostly didn't even care about it. But suddenly now we have messaging going from politicians on top down to everybody else, and as it gets filtered down, Jews eventually are kind of force fed this idea of a homeland, this idea of this place outside of the United States, this idea that there's this super complex conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, and we as Americans ought to be on the side of Israel on these questions. And although it's never really made explicit in that way, this is just basic like geopolitical strategy. This is capital strategy, all right? When you think about the kind of capital, how it was working in the 20s and 30s and the early parts of the 40s before Israel was actually formed, right? You start understanding that as far as conflicts go, this isn't really more complicated or too different from any other kind of land dispute, right? So the second bullet point, like, you don't need in-depth knowledge, right? You don't need background knowledge in unrelated fields to have something intelligent to say. Like, we don't, for example, now say that we really have to understand the nuances of colonial culture and Native American culture for us to understand the conflicts going on, 400 years ago, or 300 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, as Native Americans are systematically, pushed off of their lands, and there's like Native American terrorism as a result, right? This isn't like surprising stuff. Like, since time immemorial, anytime people get pushed off of their land, you get all manner of grisly situations, right? That's just kind of this shouldn't be too difficult to understand. And this is the lens that I want to view it through. I want to view this as a land conflict, and I think all the evidence I have here indicates that yes, this is probably best to view as a land conflict. The last part, biblical in nature, millennia in the making. You could drag the Bible in if you'd like. The only reason I would put the Bible into this question is because we ultimately do get the geopolitical justice, right, where Jews, right, are exiled from their homeland, and now suddenly, like, they are able to not only make it back to their homeland, but they're able to become A, the leading power in the Middle East, B, acquire nuclear weapons so that they are literally untouchable as if by God's graces, and C, the international community, the consensus is Israel has a right to exist, and that every other state surrounding Israel ought to recognize this fact and ought to recognize Israel as a sovereign state. So I would bring the Bible in strictly for those purposes, right? You were saying that you wanted this geopolitical justice for so long. Now you finally have it. Where do we go from here, right? So as far as the Bible is concerned and all these other questions, this is really, in my view, the only place for the Bible in this discussion. So, and just to preview kind of like some, I guess, more details in the argument before I deliver it systematically. So, point one, like I said, Israel-Palestine is a conflict that's fairly rote, right? It's very prosaic. It's a land dispute that has its origins in the competing promises made to Jews and Palestinians. And I should have amended something to this. It's not just about the promises, right? It's also the fact that we have other violations down the road, right? So. Number two, the conflict has endured because while Israel has received its full due under international law, right? This is what I said earlier. The Palestinians' own legal due, a state within pre-1967 borders, and quote, a just settlement of the refugee problem. That's from UN Resolution 242. This has not been received by the Palestinians, right? So I'm perfectly willing to concede Israel's right to exist as a state for no, even if like for no other reason than we have now like multiple generations living in this land, and it's difficult to just say you're going to up and move, because technically you could do that and it would be like a kind of justice. You're just going to create like a completely new set of problems along the way. So it's not a solution that would make sense, and it's also not a solution that fits under any international framework. So if you're so far outside of the consensus here, you might as well not even have a discussion, right? I mean, like, what are you even fighting for, right? If you have literally no one on your side, and no one will go to your side. Palestinians, they have not truly benefited from the international consensus, which was supposed to include them and does include them, right? Technically it does. We have every single year a vote for Palestinian statehood by the UN. Most recently, it was like November 20th. It was 163 to 5, right? With the entire world essentially voting for Palestinian statehood, as they do every single year, and the United States exercising its veto power in the UN to prevent that from actually happening, which also is done every single year, right? So we've had this like kind of like pinball thing going on for at least a couple of decades, I believe, that these votes have been done. And the last point is this: Israel itself, right? And I want to be very emphatic here. Israel itself is violating the very same laws which allowed it to come into existence. Now, my friend wants to bring in this kind of ahistorical notion that this was never supposed to be about the international community. This is all, just like, a bunch of brave settlers fighting for their lives. So because of that, they get kind of what they deserve, in that sense. When, in fact, like from the very beginning, Theodor Herzl, David Ben-Gurion, constantly soliciting the international community, constantly demanding a legal framework, right, for Israel to abide by, a legal framework for every other nation on earth to accept, right? So we're not going to like let the naysayers off the hook in that way, right? We have to accept the fact that Israel from the beginning, and those associated with Zionism from the beginning, they wanted an international framework, which is precisely and exactly what they received. The question is, do they now have any other obligations, right? After getting what they wanted from the international community, are they essentially allowed to become free riders, right? Are they essentially just like creating a free rider problem, right? Where, they get exactly what they want, and now they're willing to just not deal with their own responsibilities as far as the law is concerned, right? If you become a state, you suddenly have so much power, right? You have a monopoly on force, right? Like if you're Israel or any country for that matter, and you engage in, even what we might broadly define as war crimes, or things that might be war crimes, or maybe something in the middle, you're going to get a lot of leeway to behave in the way that you want to behave without really going through a lot of consequences, right? For the most part. And that's because, the community understands that, hey, we're all a world of nations, and we all have militaries, and we all have the right to use, military power as we see fit, even if there are some, laws circumscribing exactly what that looks like. Here as a state, though, like given that leeway, like if you're given that leeway, you now have a ton of responsibility, right? You're no longer just like a random person somewhere, right? As an organized show of force, you have to do certain things, right? Just like other people and other states have to do certain things. Just to give you guys some background on all this, before we even get to Israel itself, right? Before we even get to the formation of Israel, before we even get to the Palestinians, um, let's understand like Zionism as a movement, right? So Zionism first started becoming like more mainstream. I'd say there were like kind of like I guess inklings of Zionism before the 1800s, but really in the 1800s you start getting more kind of I guess Jewish settlers moving into what was then well, back then, right? This was technically part of the Ottoman Empire, right? This is what the Ottoman Empire gave up, right? This thing that we know as Israel and Palestine, that was given up after the Ottoman Empire, lost World War One. To Britain, which is why we had this kind of British mandate, right? And during this time, right, you had Jews like moving in, like they were settlers in the region, but it was very kind of disconnected. It wasn't really like politically motivated. Yes, there were like some wealthy Jews and some politically connected Jews that were kind of encouraging this, but this wasn't truly organized until we have Theodor Herzl, right? And Herzl, right? He looked at the Zionists preceding him, and he was like, you know what? These people are just a bunch of shit kickers. They're not going to get shit done, right? For us to actually create a state of Israel, we need a political program. We need Jews to become organized in terms of capital and political persuasion, right? We need to fund these, settlers, and we need to develop some kind of international framework where this is kind of, legally abided by. So in 1897, we had the first Zionist Congress, and Herzl's Basel program. This was in Switzerland, right? So Herzl's Basel program was it was geared specifically to these ends, right? So first Zionist Congress, just to put that into a little more context, you had at that point tons of people getting interested, right? 1897. First Congress, like you had like I think 30 different like members of the media arrive, right? So imagine now like you have some kind of event, right? And then like 30 different like media groups arrive. You had delegates from all over the world arriving to sort of lend political credence and credibility to this idea of a Zionist Congress, to this idea of Jews moving in and settling Palestine. And by the way, so like almost from the beginning, at least from Herzl, like maybe prior Zionism was a little bit different, but this was specifically like let's get Jews into Palestine, right? I know that there were like plans, like there were some Zionist plans at some point, I think, that wanted to settle Ethiopia. I think there were some Zionist plans for like other parts of Africa, perhaps, but here we're talking about like going into Palestine, right? So already we know what the conflict is going to be, right? People are already aware that, okay, we want Jews to settle here, fine, but there's already people living here, right? The majority of Arabs are living there. They exist, right? That needs to be done somehow. So Herzl understood this, and he was like, all right, so for us to actually have a state that has any like chance of survival, we need capital, we need politicians, we need the community, the international community behind us, we need a broad-based consensus. So this is a direct set of quotes from Herzl's own Basel program. Keep in mind what I said earlier about this idea of geopolitical justice and whether or not this was the aim from the get-go. So for those that are just listening and not seeing the text, quote, Zionism aims at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. I'm going to repeat that introductory sentence to the Basel program, okay? 1897, guys. Zionism aims at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. Okay? Legally assured does not mean local laws, right? We're talking about international consensus. They want this. They want to know, how can we do this in a way that makes sense, in a way that people will respect, in a way that will be accepted, right? So for the attainment of this purpose, the Congress considers the following means serviceable. 1, the promotion of the settlement of Jewish agriculturalists, artisans, and tradesmen in Palestine, the federation of all Jews into local or general groups according to the laws of the various countries, the strengthening of the Jewish feeling and consciousness, for preparatory steps for the attainment of those governmental grants which are necessary to the achievement of the Zionist purpose. Again, so what's happening? Okay, we have on the one hand this idea of internationally we need to be recognized, and then on the other hand we need to get these like individual sort of boons from governments, right? We need these governmental grants, right, which they will soon start acquiring, right? We're gonna start getting those British links. We're going to start getting, the lobbying of America, for this end as well. And of course, like ultimately, like with the Holocaust, whether or not like it's kind of shocking that like it's kind of like denied at this point. Like my friend, for example, sort of denies this, that the Holocaust was like a part of the equation. But like honestly, like already we have like these like liberal empathy circles expanding from like after the Enlightenment. By the time we hit the 1900s, like I understand that people view the 20th century as like especially grisly, but it's not especially grisly compared to centuries prior in terms of like proportions of like any given population killed, or the kinds of wars that we get. Those wars, in absolute terms, may have been more bloody because so many more people were involved. But as a percentage of the population dying, it's not too different from what we had centuries prior. And in some places, like it's even better. Like China during the An-Lushan Rebellion, I think the high-end estimates of deaths related to the rebellion is something like a third of Chinese people were killed in a country of at that point like a couple of 100 million. It's a lot. It's a lot of people. The seeking at this point is let's leverage not only our personal power, which Jews had some. Even with discrimination, I mean, they had more capital than a lot of people. They had more education than a lot of people. They did have some privileges in some governments. And also, finally, Holocaust comes into focus. People are just, they're outraged, right? Like, I understand that some of this has to do with the fact that, like, the victors are the Allies, so clearly the outrages of like Hitler are going to be accentuated, right? They're going to be pilloried even more. Like you don't see that much, that many attacks comparatively, when it comes to like the Allies firebombing Dresden, for instance. Although in terms of like sheer number of people killed. Civilians, that was more than America dropping nukes on Japan. So yeah, I get there's some biases there, but let's just keep in mind that we have tons of stuff happening. There's tons of factors that are going into the formation of Israel. Right? There's the Zionist movement. There's there's the Holocaust. There's the fact that just the way that power works and the way that power brokers work. Like I feel like just looking at what was going on in the 1800s, I kind of feel that this was sort of inevitable. And in fact, like Herzl himself during the first Zionist Congress, like he had a quote, right? It was something like people might make fun of us now, right, that we want this like Jewish state, but what's going to happen 5 years from now, or 10 or 20, and definitely within 50 years we will be successful. That's what he said in 1897, and literally he was correct, right? Within 50 years they were successful, right? They did have the formation of Israel, right? So, and it was again, right? The idea was international community. Let's get everybody behind us. So from this point on, right, we have a robust Zionist movement. We have growing political links to the British Empire, especially, right? Zionists, they were allied with British imperialism. They just were. This isn't like an anti-Semitic attack, mostly because that statement that I just made about Zionism could literally be made about like most, semi-strong, semi-serviceable lobby groups of any kind, right? Zionism is a particular kind of lobby group, I guess. But if you could look at like the top 20 like lobby groups or whatever, especially lobby groups that are like trying to go for geopolitical ends of some sort, they're all going to be allied with Western imperialism. I mean, because like if you're a pressure group, you're gonna lobby who? You're gonna lobby the people that have the power. The people that have the power are the ones who are engaging in imperialism. Fairly simple stuff, I think. Um, we have that emerging like especially after the first Zionist Congress, when this is now on everybody's radar. At the same time, let's just remember that in Palestine we have a bunch of Arabs that are living there. Slowly, especially after World War I, we have like states like Transjordan, right? We have we have people who are getting states individually, and others in the Arab community that are not, right? You have tons of Arabs that ultimately get subsumed under the category of Transjordan or whatever, or get subsumed under some other some other nation state that might not be their preferred nation state, right? But we have across the board, just like a robust Zionist movement, we have a robust Arab nationalist movement happening at the time as well, right? And this included Palestinian nationalism. It was fashionable in the 70s and 80s to pretend that there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. In fact, I think there was like one dumb fuck comment that I received in my Finkelstein video, where like some guy who called himself like a social or a communist or something, like proletariat dictatorship or whatever, in the comment section. And for whatever reason, he's taking the Israeli position that Palestinians as a group like sort of didn't really exist, right? They didn't have like this national consciousness, which is bullshit, right? Palestinians wanted from the beginning a state, just like anybody else wanted a state, right? And again, we're going to go through the evidence for this. Like, we have actual direct quotes. Like, I'm not just pulling things out of my ass, which is why I'm doing this stream. And in Palestine itself, I touched on this more briefly, but there's a minority of Jewish settlers, right? Especially like up to 1917, we're talking about a tiny minority, right? We're talking about like by 1917, like in 1917, it's like they're outnumbered 5-1, right? Jews are outnumbered 5-1 by Palestinian Arabs in this region. Eventually, when we get to 1947, after the Balfour Declaration, after these various like Zionist congresses, after there's like just more and more funding for the emergence of what would eventually become a state, right? We have all this infrastructure being built. You have more and more Jewish immigration, to the point where eventually they're outnumbered only 2-1, right, by Palestinian Arabs, but they're still the ethnic minority in Palestine. And conservatives now, especially my friend, right? He makes fun of Democrats, which I do too, right? He's a lot more conservative than me, but he's always making fun of like stuff like Democrats want open borders, right? Democrats don't care about settlers, just like, or like migrants just coming in and completely causing a demographic shift. But like, honestly, what is this, like 5x to 2x over the course of something like 30 years? That's a demographic shift. I see open borders. Like, there's nobody preventing the influx of Jewish settlers, despite the fact that there's an Arab community that is far less, educated, far less wealthy. They're less politically connected. The power bloc that is supposed to be on their side, right? It's not the imperial powers. It's it's the kind of like quasi-imperial powers of like various like Arab kingdoms and dictatorships and whatever, right? And as far as power brokers go, that doesn't get you all that much in the early 1900s, right? So you start getting tons of violent conflict, right, between settlers and Arabs, and this kind of starts as kind of like maybe like low scale firefights. This starts as a kind of like people hating each other, people understanding that they're sort of being displaced, and Jews knowing that if we're settlers here and we want to stay here, we're gonna have to do some displacing, which we're gonna get to a little bit later. And eventually, we have on the western side, we have Jews being armed, right, essentially, and then you also have Palestinians, right, and Arabs being armed by their kind of like power bloc. And we get the formation of paramilitaries, and these paramilitaries on both sides, sometimes they were like legitimate paramilitaries in the sense that, there was like some restraint, there was some kind of like officialdom, behind the forces. But in many cases, this was like outright terrorism. Like what we think of now is like, Muslim style terrorism of like, like literally like sabotaging trains or whatever, or, like hitting civilian targets. Jewish paramilitaries were doing this a ton, to the point that they were like, they were denounced by what would eventually become the Israeli leadership, and they were also like listed as a kind of like terrorist organization, and so on and so forth. So terrorism has a very rich history, right? It doesn't start with Muslims. And something as ready to detonate, right? Like the early kind of stellar question in Palestine. It's very predictable you would get some kind of terrorism on both sides, really, right? Before it was even clear that you would truly have a Jewish state or truly might get a Palestinian state. You still had those power blocks that were like Jews and Palestinians. They were their fucking proxies, right? They were just their proxies for how can we increase our power as power blocks. So to get support, right, for World War One, and I mean, you kind of see this all the time, right? Like, how do you recruit people for any kind of war effort? Well, you try to offer them something, and Britain could actually offer something to Jews, right? Jews who were, at the time, although yes, they were facing discrimination, many Jews did have wealth, many Jews did have political connections, and how can you get this Jewish support for your war effort? You promise them something, and in fact, like Britain was in a position to actually make this promise because they kind of had the sense that we are the British Empire, we're going to win this war, we're going to be able to get something from the Ottoman Empire, like literally from the beginning, like literally from like 1914, we had like Brits just coming together and just saying, okay, how are we going to portion out this Ottoman Empire? And one of the ideas was, we're going to get this thing that is called Palestine, and we know there's a Zionist movement, and we know that I mean, we have people living in Palestine, but it doesn't matter too much, does it? We could just make this promise to the Jews, whether or not it's empty. The fact is they made this promise, and you could say that they have some kind of obligation now. Like if Jews entered the social contract with the British Empire by saying, we're gonna support your war effort in exchange for a homeland, at minimum, like Britain owes something to Jews after 1917, right? Whether it's like something as simple as compensation, maybe they say, you know what, we can't really give you a homeland, but we're going to give you, I don't know, money or like something else. Like they're owed something, right? So this is important to understand. This is like basic like social contractarian shit, right? Like I don't want to spend too much time on that. Anyway, Balfour Declaration, right, 1917. This is Arthur Balfour. I think he was the foreign secretary in the British Empire then. To Lionel Walter Rothschild. So this was like a major Zionist power broker at the time. Obviously very wealthy, right? Rothschild, politically connected. If you're wealthy, you're going to be politically connected in the modern world, right? Even in the ancient world, obviously, right? Capital does things, right? Money is able to get you things. Near getting close to the end of the war, Balfour sends this message to Lionel Walter. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. Okay, so the question is, why would a state make this kind of promise? Again, we're back to this idea of international consensus. Zionists want an international consensus. Why wouldn't you? Like, that's the way you get shit done, right? So here we have this consensus emerging in sharper and sharper relief. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Okay, so a lot of stuff going on here, right? But let's just emphasize that point, right? So we have the British government essentially saying, this is the promise that we're making you. We will facilitate the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but it needs to be clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Now, it's perfectly reasonable for us to ask today, and even back then, honestly, especially back then, actually, that, okay, well, that sounds nice. You want to support a Jewish homeland. We have tons of pogroms everywhere. We have tons of anti-Semitism at the time, even in Britain itself. It makes sense to like have a Jewish homeland so that, you know, they could join like everybody else, these like state actors that have monopoly on force, that can protect themselves from what the world perhaps what they might want to do to Jews. But you know, what about the native population, right? I mean, we have Palestinians there that clearly greatly outnumber Jews. And I think you could say now, with some benefit of hindsight, that this doesn't make a lot of sense, right? I mean, how do you establish a Jewish state in Palestine without, quote, prejudicing the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine? I mean, do you offer them their own state? And if you do, well, do you compensate them for the land that they lose in the formation of the state? What do you do about the fact that in the formation of the state, you're going to have to do this like open borders policy where you completely change the nature, essentially, of Palestine as it's known and has been known for many, many centuries of natives. And yeah, this obviously, I mean, we now could say, right, this clearly wasn't very thought out because, you know, more than a century after the Balfour Declaration, this idea, right, not prejudicing the civil and religious rights of non-Jewish communities in Palestine, that has not been, you know, that has not been respected. Like even in terms of like, you know, Israeli citizens who happen to be, you know, Arabs and Muslims or whatever, like even if technically under the law they usually have the same rights, although there are like some specific problems with that interpretation, de facto they actually don't have the same rights, which it's kind of beyond the scope of. I don't want to get into like Israel itself too much, but it's kind of beyond the scope of the stream. But the point is like this declaration, like even back then, governments understood that, hey, if we're going to sort of get behind this, we have to do it in a way where it makes sense, right? Where we're not going to create more unnecessary conflict. So in terms of, you know, geopolitical justice, right? Geopolitical changes, like formation of new states, right? We have this idea of this is going to be done under the auspices of the international community, right? And we have to be mindful of everything and everyone that we're displacing in the process of this happening, right? Even if we're not really going to take that part seriously, we have to at least pay lip service to it because this is kind of the law, right? Even in 1917, you had international laws. You had international laws even, you know, during, you know, the Peloponnesian War, right? To the extent that you have any kind of cooperation, you have something that is loosely called the law, eventually to be formalized, you know, more greatly into like the last couple of centuries. So what was the effect of the Balfour Declaration, right? And I titled this part "Too Many Promises, or is this just all a red herring?" So after the Balfour Declaration was given, it's not as if this wasn't a controversial thing. I mean, it was fairly controversial in some ways. So this is from Wikipedia. Let's see exactly how this was taken. So, quote, In the public arena, Balfour was criticized in the House of Commons when the Liberals and Labor Socialists moved a resolution, quote, that secret treaties with the Allied governments should be revised since in their present form they are inconsistent with the object for which this country entered the war and are therefore a barrier to a democratic peace. Okay, so people see kind of from the get-go. You could talk about, what their motivations were at the time. The fact is, I mean, anyone could see that this would have some problems. And this was like vocalized much more so by Arabs than anyone else, but this was also vocalized by many people within the British government. I mean, it's very easy for us to now like sort of like apply modern thinking to like a century ago, right? We could, of course, we could easily say that yes, people back then in government or whatever, like especially British imperialists, like yeah, even like labor socialists. I mean, what's his name? Like the author of White Fang. Can't believe I forgot his name. Anyway, the author of White Fang, right? Well-known socialist and also like an excellent writer, right? Which is the annoying part about the fact that he was like an out-and-out racist. But this idea of like socialism being allied with like anti-racism, that's fairly modern. But even back then, like you still had a sort of framework, a sort of an understanding of we need to sort of get beyond just naked imperialism, right? Even if we are personally racist, even if we are personally whatever, like so, like this idea of like mandatory Palestine, these mandates under the League of Nations, their charters were very, very explicit. They were like, fine, we could acquire some territory in the short term after war, right? Which is what happened after World War One. But the only reason we're doing that is we need to take care of them, right? The white man's burden, right? Take up the white man's burden. Until it's able to sort of stand on its own, two legs, right? So even back then, right, there was this kind of very, like this kind of like liberal consensus emerging that we need to do things a different way, right? And again, that's not going to discount the fact that eventually, yes, you're going to get the Holocaust after this. Yes, all that is still there. All that is going to keep happening, but still, we had this rubric, right, that's emerging, and it's a positive thing, right? It's good that people are able to look at something like this, and on the one hand they're like, yeah, it's good that you're saying that we're not going to infringe on native Palestinian rights, but it's also good that people read a document like that and they say, you know what, you're making all these promises, but these promises are contradictory and they don't make sense, and this is going to lead to more conflict. Like it's good that people see that. So let's not just like throw away like people from a century ago, politicians from a century ago, because they are nakedly racist or they are nakedly imperialist or they're nakedly whatever. Because even back then, like those powers were kind of constrained. So in response to growing criticism arising from the seemingly contradictory commitments undertaken by the UK, yeah. So here they're talking about the McMahon-Hussein correspondence. Even in terms of like McMahon-Hussein, you guys could Google this if you want some more details. But the basic thrust of it is, the native Palestinian people, like they're always going to be these like bargaining chips for everybody involved. Like the Jews want the Palestinians sort of like, if we can't get rid of them somehow, like there's still kind of an inconvenience, like for the formation of a state. Transjordan like wants to fucking absorb the West Bank, right? Why is it called the West Bank? It's on the it's on the West Bank of the Jordan River. Jordan obviously wants to absorb the West Bank. It wants to absorb Palestine in that regard. But the question to me, the reason why I'm calling all this is the reason I'm calling all this a red herring. This idea of like too many promises is, yes, like factually, it is true that there were too many contradictory promises made, not only to Palestinians, not only to Jews, but also to like the various power blocks and power brokers. I call it a red herring because that shouldn't really be the way that we frame international consensus. I get that, in the norms of a century ago, it's going to be different. But uh, you know, Arabs living in Palestine, they're just fucking people, right? And they don't have a state. They're not under the auspices of these kinds of governments. They're like loosely, I guess, under the Ottoman Empire, but it's kind of it's a little bit of like a Wild West frontier over there. But there are people that are living there, and they've been there for generations. Like they're not somebody's fucking bargaining chips, right? They're not there like if all the powers agree, let's just fucking like throw them to Transjordan. That's not a reasonable resolution, right? It might be like reasonable enough in the sense that it contains a lot of this like factionalism in the short term, but it's like the USSR thinks like, oh, because we're all kind of Slavs, I could invade this country, that country, that country, that country, right? And we could all, speak Russian, and you could even have your own kind of, sort of native languages as well. The reason why that's not going to work is like this is like a different. These are different people with different cultures, a different world. You're not gonna just force them into this like network that exists for one purpose only, not because it's like the best thing for them, but because you personally need a way to like negotiate with all the other large powers, right? And Palestinians from the get-go, right? They're constantly these fucking bargaining chips, right? They're constantly abused, not only by Israel, which is a common thing to say, and it's a common thing to say because it's true. Yes, Palestinians get abused by Israel, but they've been nonstop abused by other Arab states, right? By other Middle Eastern states, because they're always this bargaining chip. And I don't want to view this as big power relations. I'm going to call this a red herring. I'm going to call the contradictory promises a red herring, because the bottom line is when we deal with international consensus, we need to always consider the individual feelings and the aspirations of the people, right? Not just throw them into like the arms of whatever government works for us, right? And in fact, this technically was here, we have like pretty soon the emergence of the League of Nations, within, they're not laws technically, right? But within the kind of, stipulations and the kind of directives set out by the League of Nations, not accommodating Palestinians in a way that's like fair, that's actually a violation of even something as bankrupt by today's standards as the League of Nations. So from the beginning, we have this conflict with the international consensus, okay? And it's much more than this idea of too many contradictory promises, right? That is a big power block sort of way of viewing it. That's a kind of like like crypto imperialist way of viewing it, okay? So now let's get to mandatory Palestine. So again, this idea of mandatory, for those that are not aware, League of Nations had this kind of a mandate power, right? So in nations that were sort of like scooped up, after World War One, British Empire and others, they had mandates, right? France had a mandate in what was it? It was in Lebanon, and eventually, like Algeria was part of this. I'm not sure if it was technically under that part of the mandate or it came later. And was it Syria? Anyway, we had a bunch of countries under the rubric of Britain. We had them under the rubric of France. And the mandate was always supposed to be temporary, right? Even back then, although yes, there was this kind of enduring imperialism, right? And it clearly, like countries involved in mandates, like yes, the sort of like liberal, the liberal glaze on it to make it palatable was we're going to do this temporarily so that these nations and these people could become sort of self-sustaining. But of course, while they were self-sustaining, let's just do whatever we can to get as much as we can out of these arrangements, right? So let's not be mistaken about that. But anyway, so mandatory Palestine was one of the spoils of war after World War One, taken from the Ottoman Empire, and let's just be clear about what the League of Nations mandate was. So again, this is all under the rubric of international law, international consensus, right? This was the agreement. We could say this was an insufficient agreement, whatever, but the fact is this was the agreement. So the first draft of the mandate, it was written by Zionists or written with Zionist activists, right? So at this point, after the Balfour Declaration, Britain is very explicit about what it's willing to do. Zionist activists are part of this process from the beginning, and Arabs forget about Palestinians for a second. Just Arabs on the outside, even other nations, they were not part of this mandate, which is kind of weird. I mean, I get it, the Ottoman Empire lost the war, but if you want a sustaining peace and a sustained peace, you're gonna have to give something up. You're gonna have to get input from the victors. You're gonna have to get input from the vanquished, and the fact that in 1922 we had no input from Arabs, and especially, right, to me, fuck these other states. I am more interested in, what do Palestinian Arabs get to say? Do they have any input? And of course, the answer is no, right? To go back to, again, let's not be too critical of the kind of ideas circulating in 1922, but let's also not forget the fact that we're still in a racist imperialist setting. There's no reason to assume that Arabs in any way will be part of this process. So this is a kind of even back then we had shit libs, right? Today's shit libs are going to vote for Biden because they think another Trump presidency will be too bad. They say things like we want to do harm reduction and we want to do risk mitigation, so let's all vote for Biden. And that kind of glaze, it's always been around, right? You always had a kind of bourgeois, middle class, upper class, educated, liberal kind of hegemony, right? And they wanted to see this, right? So for those that are just listening to this or not reading this, the League of Nations mandate system required that the host nation would administer each region as a, quote, sacred trust of civilization, okay? So this is shitlib glaze, but again, under the international system, this was the rubric, this was the ideal. And benefit the native people. It's not just a sacred trust of civilization where all the big players are able to get the boons, right, and the benefits of this sacred trust, right, and it benefits only their civilization. It's supposed to also benefit the native people. Okay, so question so far: have we seen this? Can we say that we're actually going to benefit native people if we have no input whatsoever from Arabs and from Palestinians in the context of racism and imperialism? The answer is no, right? So we know just a century from now, people will view the Biden voters as the shit lib glaze. This shit lib glaze was also it wasn't actually what it said it was. It was to some degree. I mean, Britain didn't just crazily exploit and enslave, Palestinian Arabs. That didn't actually happen. We've actually moved beyond in the circle of empathy. We've included Palestinian Arabs in our, circle of trust, our circle of empathy. They're human beings just like us, but, we're still not going to give them what they want, right? So in the mandate for Palestine, there was a direct promise and reiteration of a homeland for Jewish people. Fine. And there was also, just like with the Balfour Declaration, there was a direct promise that Palestinian rights would be secured, right? So this is a quote directly from the mandate. So, quote, whereas the principal allied powers have also agreed that the mandatory should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917 by the government of His Britannic Majesty. So that was the date of the Balfour Declaration. That's what it's referring to. In favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country, right? So this thing, right? This thing was reiterated, right? We need to avoid future conflict. We can't just take people's land without compensation. We can't give one group of people a state and the others are just, forced to be absorbed by a country that is not theirs. West Bank of the Jordan River is not Jordan. It's the West Bank. So this was the context. Contextualize this a little further. We now have settlers moving in just more and more and more. Right after 1917, this intensifies a lot. And honestly, like just imagine the kind of fucking conversations that Republicans have today and conservatives have today in America and also like abroad about like this idea of open borders. Like conservatives hate this idea of open borders. They hate the idea of demographic shift and demographic collapse. Or like, what country would ever agree to a demographic collapse? What country would ever agree to, yada yada yada. But essentially, this is what we have happening, right? We have a wealthier, more educated, more politically connected, and more militarily powerful bloc called, let's just call them Jewish settlers coming into Palestine. And they're buying up the land, right? They're buying up tons of land. They're jacking up the prices because that's what happens if you are able to buy land a lot. Even if you're willing to pay, above market prices, let's say, you're going to jack up the prices of surrounding land. Palestinian Arabs that spent generations there, they're like, well, what's going to happen to us, right? So this open border shit that conservatives hate, this was like Palestinians were, like, in that regard, the conservatives of their day, right? All those conservative arguments and all the fucking people that today say that Israel can't absorb any refugees whatsoever, not even 100,000. That's too much of a demographic shift. Wow, that's interesting. Back then, the demographic shift wasn't bad enough to squelch the settlement of Palestine. But today, we can't do a demographic shift because now we officially have a state, right? So that gives us the ability to do X, Y, Z outside of any kind of, international consensus. Anyway, Palestinians, like, this is just a long way of saying Palestinians were very pissed off at this point, right? They were becoming strangers in their own lands. By 1936, we had what is called the Great Palestinian Revolt. I call this in the subtitle the first Intifada, right? We have what is historically now known as the First Intifada, which was, I believe it was December 1987. I remember because that was a few months after I was born. We had the first like uprising against the occupied territories in a kind of like semi-organized fashion, but really, like, this goes back a lot, right? 1936. This was literally like 50 years before that, right? We had this uprising. Bullet points: far wealthier Jewish migrants create a major demographic shift in Palestine. Wealth, education, religion, and race. Right? Like all those things are changed, right? The levels of wealth are now different. Education is different. Religion is different. Race is different. We also, just like the proximal cause, right? There's always this idea of like, what is the ultimate cause? Well, the proximal cause, we had the Qasimite rebellion. We had the death of Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. Just, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I guess you could view him in similar fashion to maybe the way that you might view Ho Chi Minh. He was a fighter against British imperialism and French imperialism. He wasn't just like involved in Palestine, just like Ho Chi Minh, like explicitly, he was saying, I do not want French imperialism in Vietnam. This explicitly was an uprising against Britain, right? So this wasn't just like an uprising against like the Jews, the settlers, although of course settlers got involved. They committed terrorism against Palestinians. Palestinians committed terrorism against Jews. There was also like more kind of like formalized fighting with kind of like, actual named belligerents that, didn't just target civilians, but targeted actual reasonable military targets. This was an uprising against Britain, and the demands of the Great Palestinian Revolt were as follows. They want an Arab state in Palestine, right? Not fucking absorbed in Transjordan, right? Not some other solution, not just get your ass over to Turkey. We want an Arab state where we live, right? We want an end to open borders and massive land buying. Nations do this today. In Vancouver, they have new rules against Chinese nationals buying up land, because you have tons of rich Chinese families that are just kind of moving to Vancouver or traveling in between. They're able to buy up tons of land in Vancouver, jack up the prices, and the natives simply they don't have much to do there, because just I said this earlier, but if you're an immigrant, right, you already are a privileged person. If you're in a position to be able to leave a country to go to another country and actually successfully start your life there, you probably have more money, more power, more connections, more whatever, right, than the average person in that country. Same thing here. If you have tons of Chinese people that are able to buy up land, you now have a power asymmetry in Canada, where natives have a reason to feel what is left for us. So again, let's, just like with my Ahmed Arbery video, let's put ourselves in the shoes, right, to do the thing that Robert Wright might say, cognitive empathy. What would you feel as a Palestinian at the time, right? So the demand was, let's stop these open borders, guys. They were the anti-AOCs, to use the modern parlance of the time. And this was done through general strikes, war, and paramilitary terrorism, right? General strikes were called by Palestinian Arabs. They were also called later on when Jews started rebelling against the British mandate shortly before the Declaration of Independence. They also called for general strikes, and also we had war and paramilitary terrorism coming from them. During this uprising, we have 5,000 dead Palestinians and a few hundred Jews. This is more or less what you would expect, with the context of, again, imperialism and racism, and also the fact that this is an explicitly Palestinian uprising against the state. So this is going to be kind of state-led violence, right? Jews did not really get as much caught up in this way at the time, at least. And because of this, right, because of the fact that you had this uprising going on for a couple of years, this cemented the military relationship between the British Empire and Jewish settlers. And also, finally, of course, we had no firm Arab world to counterbalance the French and British mandate. So this is just very important, right? It's one thing for Jews to say, okay, we're going to further align ourselves with the Brits. It's another thing to say we're going to do that, and on the other side, Palestinian Arabs have no one that they could reasonably ally with, that that could actually do something for them. Again, Ottoman Empire already lost, so that power's out the window. You're now getting an ever decreasing number of military powers that could sort of take up your cause. Of course, they're going to take up your cause for the sake of their own benefit, just like America ultimately took on the cause of Israel, not because it has some special love for Jewish people or whatever the fuck. It did it because it could, it gets something from having an extremely loyal ally in that part of the Middle East, right? That at least superficially looks like a democracy. And if you are the United States and you believe in typical liberal hegemony, liberal internationalism, right, you're gonna accept the idea that the more democracies that you have, just ipso facto, you're gonna have less and less war and other kinds of conflict. So this is the reason why great powers compete for the attention of and the promises made to these individual groups that might otherwise not have a lot of power without them, right? Which it's not necessarily a bad thing, but the way that historically it's been done, right, given the kind of asymmetries that exist, clearly it's been done the wrong way. So 1936, this thing starts, right? The uprising starts. It's bad. Like this kind of guerrilla warfare the Brits don't have much an answer for. They ultimately duck the fuck out of Israel because when the Jewish uprising starts, which is like even better armed than the Palestinian one, they have no way of dealing with these kinds of tactics. Like as so many countries in the 20th century would learn, right? You can't win a conventional war if you're essentially fighting guerrillas, right? So in response to this, we have something called the Peel Commission. So Lord William Robert Peel in 1936, he's tasked with understanding the hostilities in Palestine. So why are Palestinian Arabs behaving in this way, right? Why are they taking up arms against Britain, and why are they committing, both acts of terrorism against like Jewish civilians and settlers, and also why are they organizing in paramilitary fashion to fight against the Arabs? And the Peel Commission, again, in the context of racism and imperialism, this is what the findings were. Quote, the overriding desire of the Arab leaders was national independence, and it was only to be expected that Palestinian Arabs should envy and seek to emulate their successful fellow nationalists in neighboring countries. Again, we already have, after the Ottoman Empire collapses, we have Transjordan, right? We have, Egypt. We have Arabs that have, some level of sovereignty, some level of self-determination. Palestinian Arabs do not, right? So the Peel Commission, this is their conclusion as to the nature of these hostilities. And again, I like it like if this was like any other fucking conflict, like if this was like if I were talking to you guys about Native Americans and why there was such a thing as like Native American terrorism, why did Native American tribes often like raid, I don't know, colonial villages and like scalp men and like rape women and murder children? Well, it's because we have a series of land disputes, right? I wouldn't have to make that clear, but because of the nature of how like political language is used and how political opinions are formed, again, remember what I said from the beginning, political opinions are formed not bottom up, they're top down, right? The nature of modern capital, the way that these cartels get organized, political opinions get taken from the top down to the bottom, right? This is why people could vote against their interests all the time, whether it's Democrat or Republican, constantly voting against their own interests, no matter who you are, right? Because you're made to believe that really the actual conflict is Dem versus Republican, right? It's not. We need something other than these two groups. And same thing today, like when it comes to Israel and Palestine, these opinions are taken from up high. No other country really has that much interest in Israel as a strategic partner. So therefore, every country in the world every single year votes for Palestinian statehood. America doesn't. So I have to like do this kind of dumb fuck like over and over and over again. These like disclaimers and these like contextualizing why Palestinians might have been upset in 1936. Like, to the extent that I even have to do that, it tells you how disingenuous so much of this conversation is, and even when my friend says how disingenuous it is. So the Peel Commission, this part is important. It recommended a partition plan, right? So maybe this wasn't the first like formal recommendation of how do we partition Palestine for Jews and Palestinian Arabs, but it was the first one that was like really like recognized, I guess. So it recommended a partition plan as part of a two-state solution, but had a much ridiculed population transfer, with the worst and least arable land going to Palestinian Arabs under the auspices of Transjordan. So let's just remember this for a second. This original partition plan made by Britain in 1936, it didn't even try to give Palestinian Arabs their own state west of the Jordan River, right? It just said, we're just gonna we're just gonna send you under Transjordan. Transjordan is gonna control this land, and this will be your state. And also the final part is this: the population transfer was if the natives would refuse to leave. So if a bunch of Palestinians said, listen, I'm not fucking moving out of my house, like I'm going to stay here, it was going to be, quote, compulsory, right? So this was a direct quote from the partition plan in the Peel Commission. It was going to be a compulsory thing, right? You're going to do this under the threat of violence. So neither the Arabs nor the Zionist Congress agreed to the Peel partition, with Zionist leadership, especially David Ben-Gurion, advocating publicly and privately for a greater Israel. We're going to get into this a little bit later, but the basic conflict is this: Arabs like hate the terms, right? Obviously of the partition, but the Zionist Congress. I'm sure that many of them were happy to like receive even this like partition plan. Like it's another like further cementing of this recognition that we're eventually going to get a state. But like David Ben-Gurion, and we're gonna get quotes from all these people later on, so that again you see that I'm not bullshitting you. David Ben-Gurion, from the beginning, he was like, any partition plan is a nice start. Even the fucking 1947, 1949 Green Line, like the armistice lines after the Israeli War of Independence, like even that was insufficient, right? That was still to him a starting point, right? Eventually, it was supposed to be, we're going to control the entirety of Palestine. So we had, right, and oftentimes like part of the propaganda is, well, the Arabs like rejected every partition plan, including this, and Jews, they wanted it from the beginning, right? They wanted to be fair. Jews were always the ones that were constructive in that sense. But again, 1936 Zionists did reject the Peel Commission's partition plan. Like, so don't let somebody do their propaganda tricks on you. So the Arab reaction to the partition plan was this. So entire spectrum of Palestinian Arab society rejected the partition plan, obviously. There was widespread public opposition, including in the media and by religious figures. The Arabs saw the publication of the plan as a ringing disavowal of every key undertaking the mandatory authorities had made since its inception. Again, this partition plan absolutely is a violation of the League of Nations mandate. So this already Britain is like violating the terms of its mandate. That there would be no separate Jewish state, no land expropriations, and no expulsions of people. The proposed land swaps and population transfers were seen as annulling and inverting a century of economic development of the littoral region, with apart from Jaffa and Gaza, Palestinians dispossessed of the essential rural and urban heritage that had evolved over the preceding century of coastal development. Jerusalem was placed outside the future Palestinian state. So even I think, under the UN plan, Jerusalem was supposed to be controlled. It was supposed to be kind of like an international city, I guess. But to not have, even like half of Jerusalem controlled, like really by Jews and by Palestinians, like it's really a non-starter kind of like for everybody involved. Palestinians were shocked, both by the declaration that their land would be divided. Again, imagine that you're living there and somebody like comes up with this plan like, hey, within 10, maybe 20 years, your home, your possessions, all of that, we're just going to remove that. Maybe you'll get compensation, maybe you won't. As it turns out, they didn't get compensation really. So they're upset about that. And they're also upset that they themselves would be denied statehood, but only a union with Transjordan. Again, Palestinian Arabs, they actually did exist. I know that it's crazy, like in a world where people say shit like Palestinian Arabs just don't exist, but they never wanted to be part of Transjordan. While the Jewish state, extending over a third of the country, would absorb the whole of the Galilee, where an overwhelming percentage of the land was owned by Arabs and Jews had only a slender presence. In compensation, the Arabs were offered valuable areas to the east of Jordan and the southern portion of the Basin subdistrict where irrigation would have been possible. So, like, literally, it's like, okay, forget the irrigation that you've already created. Forget about the land you've already developed. You're going to do that century of settlement again now from the beginning. So maybe you'll get back to parity, by 2036, right? Which, even less than that happened, right?
So indignation was widespread. Arabs complained that they simply got, quote, the barren mountains, while the Jews would receive most of the 5 cultivable plains. The plan envisaged giving Zionists the best land, with 82% of Palestine's principal export, citrus fruit, consigned to Jewish control, which, this ultimately is what happened. Uh, yeah, so, the population transfer, I mean, controversial at any time. But, even if we kind of consider it controversial now, just contextualize a little bit, like, uh, the British didn't just like arbitrarily, sorry, they didn't just arbitrarily come up with this. Like, there was like historical precedent here, right? The model of Greece and Turkey in 1923. We had other examples of like semi successful population transfers, but obviously controversial every time that it would happen. If not in the media, like who knows like what the media talked about in population transfers of a century ago, like whatever the equivalent was of like a shitload media. But what about to the people? Like, was it controversial among the natives? The answer, of course, would always be yes. Like, it would always be controversial among natives. So, in response to all this controversy, and in response to the fact that the Peel Commission did not actually have a workable plan, the Woodhead Commission was created in response to the blowback. And so there were 3 plans, right? There was a Plan A, Plan B, Plan C. Plan A, it was pretty similar to the partition plan. It was rejected because of another. They call it a non-compulsory population transfer. By the way, so even in this plan, again, to reiterate Palestinian rights, the Brits said the Palestinians, quote, have a deep attachment to the land, right? So they're saying, okay, so we're not going to make this compulsory, but of course the question is always, well, if it's not compulsory, what do you do about the fact that most people probably would say no to leaving? Like, even in terms of like giving some kind of compensation, most people will say no. What do you do about that fact, right? So even if it's not compulsory, it's hard to escape the logic that ultimately, compulsion is going to have to be part of the equation. So Plan A gets rejected. Plan B offered more land to the Palestinians, including the Galilee, which the British rejected as a non-starter given Jewish demands and security concerns, right? It's still, this is still kind of like a talking point. We don't even have to get into whether or not it's right. The fact is, back then, this was the idea. Plan C, new land, also like new mandates. So like we were gonna like in some way, I guess, extend these like League of Nations mandates, which like if your idea is you want people to stand on their own 2 legs, you can't just have this like perpetual set of excuses for perpetual mandates, right? So 1939 through 1948. So we had that first intifada, right? 1936 to 39, Palestinian Arab uprising against the British. Now you have almost a decade of Jewish insurgency, which was bloodier. It was far better armed, and you had like this is when like you had the clearest cut examples of like explicit racism on both sides, but really being kicked up a notch from Jewish terrorist groups. And the reason why we had this insurgency, just like we had a proximal cause, back here, right? We had so 1936 to 39, we had the Cassamite Rebellion. We had the open border stuff, like we had it. That's also like other like anti-imperialists at the time, uprising based on that. Here we have a proximal cause for this Jewish rebellion, something called the White Paper of 1939. So in response to all of these like Palestinian demands, like after this uprising, right? The British said, okay, well, we wouldn't stand for open borders in our country. We wouldn't stand for a massive demographic shift and perhaps even collapse in our own country. So we can understand why Palestinian Arabs are upset at this. So we have the White Paper of 1939. I think technically it's called like the Churchill White Paper of 1939. I don't really remember. It rejected partition, but it reduced Jewish immigration and most non-Jewish land purchases. So at this point, I think like 95% of the land was not available to be purchased by Jews, like under this, like, I guess, new set of laws. And of course, like, if you're, a settler, or if you want to be a settler, if you're moving in, or if you're living there and you want to buy up land, you're like, fuck this. I used to be able to do whatever I want. Now they're telling me I can't. So like this was literally the cause, right? Jews said, I get it. We don't want, and by the way, I probably shouldn't even say Jews. Like, I should be explicit and say settlers. Most Jews had nothing to do with Israel. Most Jews, like in America, they could not give a fuck about this kind of thing. They, to them, it was just this thing that was happening in the Middle East. Even after the Holocaust, they're like, we're just staying in America. It seems pretty safe here for us. But, there we had, Jewish settlers, and they were saying, okay, so yeah, we're causing this demographic shift. Yes, we're completely upending the life of Palestinian Arabs. And of course, we're going to have to get some kind of population transfer ultimately if we get the state that we want. But we're going to reject any kind of reduction of our rights here. And at this point, of course, the rights are simply what the mandate allows. Anyway, 1939 hits, White Paper, boom, we have a Jewish rebellion. This group, right, Irgun, Lehi, the Stern Gang. So Irgun was probably the most well-known terrorist group in Palestine at the time. But in fact, like, at some point, I guess it wasn't extreme enough for Abraham Stern, who later on formed Lehi, which was now kind of like known as the Stern Gang. And he continued his terrorism later under the auspices of Lehi. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And to be fair to like Israel and the international community, like Irgun and Lehi, they were universally condemned, right? There was no place for Lehi in Israel, at least officially, right? Tons of settlers, of course, would support them. You still are able to get somehow, right? Somehow you keep getting these arms, right? Somehow Irgun is able to like actually put up a real fight against the British. So and most of these targets, yes, Palestinian civilians were targeted here as well, but this was mostly targeting British soldiers as well as like other civilians, right? So just kind of like a broad-based like terrorist group, I guess. And this is the second part. Sometimes you get like a lot of these like, I guess, like modern day like Israeli talking points, like, oh, but Palestinian terrorists, they were forming alliances with Mussolini, with Hitler. Yeah, like this is true, they were, but so were Jewish terrorists, right? I mean, like what I said earlier about like power block politics. This is not this is not any different in this regard. Like you're not gonna like be preferential here. Like, oh, like I'm gonna sign up for British imperialism, but not Mussolini, not Hitler, not fascism. Like if you're the type of person that says, okay, I am crazy and zealous enough to be a Jewish or Palestinian terrorist, you're gonna form alliances wherever you can, right? Especially if you delude yourself into thinking that my long-term goal here is so good and so moral and so righteous that ultimately I can form these alliances because it's for the greater good, even if in the short term it looks bad. So Britain is not able to counteract these attacks, and emphasizes the need to end mandatory Palestine, right? So they duck out, like they literally could not deal with these attacks, right? And ultimately, what I said earlier, the Holocaust provides a sharp and immediate rationale for a Jewish state. It's not a coincidence that after the Holocaust, right, just a few years after the Holocaust, we have a Jewish state. Yes, of course, having the settlers there, having the Zionist kind of like, political affiliations and the machinations of capital, right? World capital, really. All that helped, but the Holocaust really, and if you look at like a lot of the kind of like UN statements around the time about Jews, about the Holocaust, about a state, a lot of this was kind of like intermingled. So again, back to this idea of geopolitical justice. Is there such a thing as geopolitical justice? Well, when it comes to Jews and Zionists talking about the formation of a state, yes, the Holocaust was part of that conversation, right? When we look at what the great powers were saying, yes, the Holocaust was part of the conversation. Yes, it was seen as creating geopolitical justice. And this is just to this is the demographics of Palestine throughout time. In the 80s, there was this book that was a bestseller at the time, Joan Peters' From Time Immemorial, which essentially argued that Palestinian Arabs are a modern day propaganda creation of Arab states and like anti-Semites that actually Palestinian Arabs never actually existed. It was the Jews that came there and turned this like terrible unused land into something productive. But of course, like reality, tells us a different story. So we see first century, Jews were the majority. Fourth century, Jews were still the majority in Palestine. And by the 5th century, right, obviously, we have the conversion of Constantine to Christianity. You obviously have a demographic shift, for those reasons alone. I mean, Roman Empire, whatever, Byzantine Empire, auspices of Christianity. Then the Jews are still a minority in the 1500s to 1600s. In fact, like in the 1500s, Muslims, so for those that are just listening and not watching, we have 5 Jews for every 145 Muslims. And this is, by the way, in thousands. So 5,000 Jews and 145,000 Muslims and 6,000 Christians. By 1800, that changes, but it doesn't change that much for Jews, right? We go from 5,000 to 7,000 Jews, but we have almost a doubling of the number of Muslims, right? So by the 1800s, we have an acceleration of like immigration there, but it's actually coming from Arabs and Muslims more broadly. I guess not everybody that's a Muslim is an Arab. By 1890, 43,000 versus 432,000. So literally at this point, 1890, when Theodor Herzl was already agitating for the Zionist movement, we are talking about Jews being outnumbered there 10-1. So after the Balfour Declaration, right, 1922, we have 84 versus 589,000. Then by 1947, 630,000 versus 1,181,000 Muslims, right? So by 1947, this is when the UN has its resolution, November 1947, to partition Israel for a Jewish state and for a Palestinian state. We have a 2-1 outnumbering of Jews by the native Muslim population there. And you have a smattering of Christians, 143,000. So just to give people a sense of what's going on, right? This isn't just like, made up bullshit, right? This is demographically actually what's happening. We have a demographic shift. We have an open borders policy. We have, strangely enough, the Jews behaving as the modern day open border AOC to the extent that she is even that, which she isn't. But that's part of the propaganda. And you have the Palestinians doing the exact opposite, saying we don't want our borders disrupted. We don't want our way of life completely upended. So, okay, so we had like 8-9 years of a Jewish rebellion against the British. And ultimately, like we're going to get, right, Israel's War of Independence. So 1947, UN's resolution 8181 part 2. So we had all these like other partition plans, we had other forms of international consensus, whatever. All these prior proposals, right? The Peel Commission, Moorhead, whatever. All of that like goes out the window with the UN. I mean, the UN is like like post like, and just to a little bit more context. Another thing that really like annoys me about arguing with my friend about this is, he constantly poo-poos like international consensus. Of course he has to, because like to defend Israel, you have to pretend like international law doesn't matter. So some motivated reasoning there. But the post-Hitler order, right? Those set of laws, right? That ultimately kind of like created the framework for the UN, right? We had League of Nations, and now we have these amendments, right? Essentially, a bunch of amendments get tacked onto the League of Nations, and that becomes the UN in some ways. And one of the things that after seeing Hitler just like willy-nilly invading whatever he wants, like people said, you know what, like this doesn't seem like a good idea. The idea that you could acquire land by conquest just seems so fucking insane and so against even like the liberal internationalist order that we're not gonna stomach that. So all these laws, right, and all these proposals and all these ideas and all this stuff about self-determination and sovereignty and whatever, a lot of that comes from the fact that the Allies are ascendant over Hitler. And they don't want to repeat Hitler. And you know what? You could talk all the shit you want about international law. The fact is, since 1945, we've had a pretty good record of the West not engaging in wars against itself. Okay? And the wars that engage against other people, yes, they've been fucking grisly. They're not defensible in any way. But those casualties just kept going down and down and down, right? War today is not anywhere near the way that war was in 1945, much less, the 1500s, much less something like, a domestic dispute like the Andalusian Rebellion during the kind of, I guess, well, it wasn't the end of the Tang Dynasty, but it kind of like technically heralded the end of the Tang Dynasty, because after Andalusian you're gonna have to get some century of decline, right? I think it's Tang Song. Anyway. So this is the context, right? We don't want to repeat the kinds of shit that we saw during World War II, right? So in a 33-13 vote, and this is the thing, my friend, when he was arguing with me about this, he's like, that UN resolution from 1947 barely passed. I don't know what he would define as barely passing, but 33-13 seems like it's a fairly reasonable majority, especially in light of the fact that this was a very controversial resolution for the following reasons. So, 181 proposed a Jewish state, an Arab state, and UN control of Jerusalem. I don't exactly remember what this was. I don't think at this point it was under the auspices of Transjordan. Maybe it was explicitly like a Palestinian Arab state, like west of the Jordan River. But let's just assume, right, that the UN like had the Palestinians' best interest in mind here. So UN control of Jerusalem, right, international city. We know that Jerusalem is both special to Jews and Muslims. We don't want to inflame any kind of tensions, which is why, of course, like it's just so insane today, right? How just Trump just says like we're gonna fucking move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The reason why it was so controversial is the international consensus for a two-state solution has East Jerusalem, where the majority of Palestinians reside in that city. East Jerusalem is the capital of this framework for Palestine. Moving the embassy to Jerusalem is just kind of like, well, actually, no, we don't have a state here, and this is now the city that fully belongs to Israel, and it's no longer an international city. So I was actually surprised when I learned this part for the first time, that they were forward thinking enough to say that we can't just pretend that Jerusalem itself is not a problem. So Israel would have 498,000 Jews versus 407,000 Arabs within its borders. So just from the get-go, like before you know anything else, like knowing how Israel is today, we know that this is a problem because Jews said from the beginning, right? Again, I don't want to say Jews because especially now, like more and more Jews in America, like they're like, fuck this. I don't want anything to do with an apartheid state. Desmond Tutu is saying it's an apartheid state, and I respect him. Blah blah blah, right? But like demographically, this is very uneven, especially if especially like assume these are all rich Jews, and assume that these are like not impoverished Arabs, but more poor than the Jewish settlers. Like, what's going to happen is you're going to have you're going to have an increase in the Jewish population, yes, but it's not going to be as fast as the increase in the Palestinian Arab population, because we know that as you move up in the socioeconomic ladder, you're less and less willing to have children, partly because like you have a career to kind of think about your kind of a biological impetus, right, to talk about to have children is sort of sublimated into a career. It's sublimated into, I don't know, or in my case, I don't have kids yet. It's been so far that drive has been sublimated into writing and into like doing shit like this. Like eventually, like this number would have like absolutely overtaken the number of Jews, right? Simply for socioeconomic reasons, right? So this already was a not stable coalition, and to the extent that the international community understood what Zionists wanted, which is a pure Jewish state, as majoritarian as possible. This part probably wasn't planned out as well, or maybe they did plan it. Say, you know what, Israel, fuck you. Like, you guys say you want a pure state, but we can't do that with the reality of who's actually living there right now. So let's not let's not go there. Like, you're gonna have to deal with it somehow. But like just looking at these numbers, like you would know, like this would be a problem, right? Now this is where it gets even dicier. Right, so 55.5% of land would go to the Jews, mostly recent immigrants, right, after Balfour, who made up 1/3 of the population in 1947. So if you're outnumbered 2-1, functionally you're about 1/3 of the population. The vast majority of the best arable land, including citrus plantations, half of which were owned by Palestinian Arabs prior to 1948, were to go to Jewish settlers. So this is 1947, not even 1947. We're going to get to this. The actual international consensus, it's not even 1947, which is clearly unfair, right? I mean, this is an unfair division of land. But right now, like the international consensus is the armistice lines of 1949, right? The green line, which gives Jews 22% land in addition to what they got here. So they essentially get, pretty much like 80% of the land, right? After 1949, and that is now the international framework for geopolitical justice. The settlers, who were a minority, get the majority of the land. Arabs, they get a Palestinian state that is just the worst land, and that is just a tiny proportion of the land, right? So when we think about what's fair and what's not, let's just keep these facts in mind. So this is a quote from Norman Finkelstein's book, Beyond Chutzpah. I think I still have it here with me. No, I left it upstairs. I was reading stuff about like the 1967 war last night. I had it with me upstairs in bed. I wanted to show it to you guys, but anyway, I'm gonna put a link to purchase that book when I clip this. It's a really good book, one of his best. If you want to understand the Israel and Palestine, this gives you so much really good information. So a quote from Beyond Chutzpah: "The embryonic Jewish state emerging from the British Mandate was imposed by force on and against the will of the indigenous Palestinian Arab population. On no generally accepted principles of morality or law could this flagrant violation of the Palestinians' right to self-determination be justified." So again, this part is correct. This division, although it's supposed to be technically like legal and under the auspices of the law, this actually was a violation of the mandate. This actually was a violation of even like the UN's own set of charters, right? Which like tons of legal arguments from Arab states were made while all this was going on, like arguing this point. And we don't talk about it now because it's like you just can't fucking go back to 1947, can you? Dershowitz professor. So beyond Chutzpah, for those of you who don't know, so Alan Dershowitz has his book called Chutzpah from I think it's the 80s or the early 90s, and Finkelstein, in response to a more recent book from 2003 called The Case for Israel, Finkelstein wrote Beyond Chutzpah, and he goes in explicit detail, like point by point. He goes through every reference that Dershowitz makes. Right, he goes through all those books. He shows why Dershowitz's book is a complete fraud. It's a fabrication of the evidence that Dershowitz pretended to actually cite. So Alan Dershowitz professes to, quote, know of no situation in history where a state has twice rejected generous offers of statehood. So keep this in mind. Dershowitz calls this UN Resolution 181 as a generous offer to the Palestinians. So Finkelstein says, yet is there any example in history of a people voluntarily relinquishing a fragment, let alone most, of their country to settlers coming from abroad to colonize it and then drive them out? Again, open borders, guys. All the fucking conservatives are on the kind of macro, pro-Israel side. Just try to be at least fucking consistent in your arguments, right? The UN Partition Resolution giving Zionists title to part of Palestine appeared to ratify their usurpation as well as, quote, the flouting of a fundamental principle of the UN organization itself, the imposition of a form of government against the wishes of the majority of the inhabitants. And that quotes from historian, is this WM short for William? Roger Lewis, maybe. Anyway, the resolution's terms exacerbated this seeming injustice. Quote, the partition resolution awarded 55.5% of the total area of Palestine to the Jews, most of whom were recent immigrants, who constituted less than a third of the population and who owned less than 7% of the land, historian Walid Khalidi writes. The Palestinians, on the other hand, who made up over 2/3 of the population and who owned the vast bulk of the land, were awarded 45.5% of the country, of which they had enjoyed continuous possession for centuries, end quote. Moreover, quote, the best lands were incorporated within the proposed Jewish state, most of the fertile coastal plains and all the interior plains. These included almost all the citrus and cereal producing areas. Half of the former and the vast bulk of the latter were owned by Palestinians, end quote. That a UN General Assembly majority approved the partition resolution, Lewis recalls, was due in no small part to Zionist machination. Quote, the Zionists were able to launch a campaign that left the president and officials at the State Department reeling under a bombardment of letters, telegrams, and telephone calls. I'm not gonna go over what Truman said about this part or what others said about it, but there was like Costa Rica was bribed to vote in this way. Truman said that this was like it was crazy pressure, and this isn't to like sort of ascribe like those like nefarious kind of Jewish conspiracy, too much power motives, on the Jews. I mean, like I said earlier, just treat this as a fucking lobby group. Like this is this is a capital cartel, right? A capitalist cartel lobby group, right? Of people that want certain ends. And what is the ends that they want? They want a state. Why do you want a state? Because if you could organize capital in such a way under the rubric of a state, capital is able to flow, it's able to be protected, it's able to have a police force behind it. And Zionists, they had these political links and they used them, right? This is no different than any other lobby group. If it wasn't Zionists, if it was some other group of people that by historical circumstance wanted a piece of land or wanted whatever, and they would exert this kind of pressure, they would have gotten the same thing, right? This isn't special, right? There's nothing special about Zionists. There's nothing special about Jews. Yes, both, like in John J. Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt in the Israel Lobby, they talk about how powerful that lobby is. Obama's recent memoir, actually, he talks about how when he tried to do things that were kind of like, I guess, like very, very subtly pro-Palestinian, there actually is no difference between Democrats and Republicans on the question of Israel and Palestine, actually. But even Obama, he said, like, listen, I was shocked by how powerful the Israel lobby was. Like, I treated it as a lobby like any other lobby, but they were more powerful on average than other lobbies. Why? Likely because you have, more sophisticated political actors, richer people involved, whatever. And also, obviously, since America decided that Israel was going to be an ally, right? It makes perfect sense to Israel. To America and to Israel, that there's going to be this lobby that tries to do what it does, right? Again, not very special in that regard. If you want to read the rest of this stuff, I'm going to put this in the show notes when I clip this. This resolution passes November 1947, and immediately clashes between Jews and Arabs. They start to intensify, right? Clearly, we now have a framework for a state, and this is not a state that Palestinians really want, the way that it's written. So you have a true civil war that breaks out, which goes from small-scale terrorism to formal operations. So seeing this, right, seeing this kind of conflict, they're like, okay, clearly there's something wrong with the UN partition plan. So the U.S. withdraws its support for the partition plan. This thing about the U.S. being this great ally of Israel and always doing what Israel wants. This is not historically this wasn't always the case. Pre-1967, the United States did not have any really special interest in Israel, so they were able to just be like, fuck it, we're not gonna support this. You can't imagine doing that now. You can't even imagine the United States feeling personally responsible for the advent of a Palestinian state. If you really want to show the world, Democrats, that you're different from Republicans on this question, when you have your fucking ambassador sit in on these annual meetings when they do this perfunctory vote, don't veto. just don't veto. Abstain from the vote. Do not use the veto power. And you could pretend like you had nothing to do with the business of a Palestinian state, and woe is me. We just couldn't prevent the international community from pressuring Israel into this, right? You could do that if you want, but they're not going to do that. Biden's going to come into office. You're going to have 4 years of these votes. My prediction, every single time that this comes to a vote, UN vetoes it, right? Just like they do every single year. 163 to 5 every single year, right? The British formally supports Transjordan's annexation of Arab Palestine. So just keep this in mind. Back to the context of imperialism. After this passes, they're like, all right, so this is getting too crazy for us. We're gonna have to pull out of Palestine ourselves, and now we're just going to support formally Transjordan just taking Palestine for itself. Again, big player, big block politics, back in play. Because of this fighting, 100,000 Palestinian Arabs flee, including from within Israel proper. Right, so this is a significant enough number, right? That's gonna cause some demographic dent. So we have a war, right? I guess you could say maybe the technical time for the war to start would be after the Declaration of Independence from Israel, but we had starting in January 1948, we had these formal operations already beginning. So technically, the war started before that. David Ben-Gurion declares Israeli independence, and Israel is recognized immediately by both superpowers. The Arab League invades, quote, to protect Palestinians. It's not the entire Arab League. It was just Iraq, Transjordan, Syria, Egypt, and later on Lebanon. And by the way, just don't ever take this kind of shit at face value, right? It's not the Arab League invades to protect Palestinians. Let's understand actually what happened. this area, like any other small, shit kicker area in the world, right, that innately doesn't have that much power to begin with. It's just like a bargaining chip. It's like a piece for like big power negotiations. And Arabs, they're like, Palestinians have become this rallying cry. This is now like well known in the international community that this whole thing is a shit show. So this now is going to become our personal bargaining chip, the Palestinians, and we're going to mistreat them how we want, but we're also going to give them money, and we're just going to use them as a means to our own personal ends, right? So this is the way that I always view, this kind of thing. I called that earlier shit a red herring, too many competing promises, because ultimately the question needs to be one of what is going on, right? Like, what is going on with the native population? What is their say in this matter? This we're going to invade to protect Palestinians. It's no, we're going to invade to protect our bargaining chip because this is being taken away from us. And now, by having this kind of like semi-permanent like presence in this community, we're going to now systematically get things from them. And this is especially desirable because at the time, right, even now to this day, although yes, they voted for Hamas in 2006, that Hamas vote only happened because Fatah was so fucked up and so corrupt and so evil, right? Just like Hamas is evil. I mean, there's no really real difference, but Palestinians are very secular. I'm not sure if people saw photos of like, the Israeli War of Independence, but, I think 25% of the Palestinian army was women, right? There were literally women that were like in actual direct face-to-face combat roles. This is a secular, nation, which is the crazy part. Like you want secular nations in your access. Like if you're a liberal interventionist, a liberal internationalist, a liberal, hegemonic shit lib, right? We could use the technical language, we could use the euphemisms, right? But you want democratic, secular powers, right, on your side, right? Which is why, like, the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran was so fucking insane, right? Which is why not giving Palestinians a state as a kind of bulwark against, some of these other countries that you kind of want to, like, quote unquote discipline, even from a purely like imperialistic standpoint, this was just a stupid set of policies. Anyway, so the outcome of the war is, like I said earlier, we have a green line, armistice line. Israel acquires 22% more land than under the UN partition, and I want to, again, back to geopolitical justice. I want to impress this point upon everybody. When we have the Oslo Accords, when we have Taba, when we have Camp David, the green line armistice lines, right? That is the international consensus that emerged like after the 1967 UN 242 resolution, right? You can't acquire land by way of military conquest. After that point, the international community said, listen, we want Palestinians to have a state, but it's going to be a state alongside the Green Line. So it's not even according to this unfair 1947 partition, right? We're past that. There's no going back to 1947, right? As fucked up and unfair and unjust the 1947 181 plan was, that is not the international consensus any longer. The consensus is the Green Line, okay? So we have now moved to an even less fair status quo. And Palestinians in Taba, Palestinians in Oslo, Palestinians in Camp David, they accepted the Green Line, okay? They accepted even less land, okay? So when Dershowitz says shit like, a generous offer of land, or when you see Blitzer say generous offers, or in the media says we have generous offers, why don't the Palestinians come to the table? Already keep the following in mind. Not only is Israel, and United States for that matter, by backing Israel, still trying to fucking nickel and dime Palestinians for everything they got, right? Recently, Netanyahu attempted unsuccessfully to annex those portions of the West Bank and even more that had settlements. not only are they being nickel and dimed that way, they've already been nickel and dimed from the beginning. And they've accepted the nickel and diming as part of an international agreement just to get some kind of fucking state that makes sense. Okay, so let's remember that, right? When we talk about generosity, when we talk about why don't Palestinians come to the table, they do come to the table. They give Israel more than its legal due. The legal due for Israel was 1947. That was the international consensus that David Ben-Gurion accepted. This was functionally the consensus that people like Herzl aimed for, right? That was Israel's legal due. Israel got more than its legal due. And any fucking peace plan that comes today to pass with a Palestinian state, they will have more, right? Not the Palestinians, but Israelis will have more than their legal due. And so far, Palestinians have nothing, right? Have nothing of the legal due that has been promised to them since 1947. Since even 1949, since 1967. That's been off the table. Let's remember that when we go back to this question of geopolitical justice. And this part is important. We're gonna read this in full, right? So this is David Ben-Gurion's Declaration of Independence. I don't know if he actually was the one that fully wrote this or not, but nonetheless, this is what he went on TV or the radio or whatever to actually read out loud. So let's keep in mind what I just said about international consensus when you read this Declaration of Independence, and think about how even this Declaration of Independence, how far removed it is from the mainstream discussion of Israel and Palestine today. Let's just set that as a context, right? So to begin, quote, "The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom." Wow. That sounds a whole lot to me like geopolitical justice. A geopolitical justice that doesn't just span the modern age. It literally fucking goes back to the Bible, okay? It goes back to thousands of years of history, right? To say that we need our biblical due. We need our due as the birthplace of the Jewish people. Now, of course, I know a lot of this is like, just propaganda, right? This is like an easy way to get people on your side. I get that. But to the extent that this kind of, propaganda is used to get the international community around you, like, keep in mind that after you get the international consensus, you're now bound by that social contract, right? So, again, from my friend, if you're watching this, Adam, you said there's no geopolitical justice. In the first paragraph of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, David Ben-Gurion is framing everything, positively everything, under the rubric of long-term, even biblical geopolitical justice. There's no way to fucking denying it. It's staring at you in the face in the very first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence before the war, okay? Impelled by this historic and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. This isn't really true, though, right? That part isn't true. This is now just more kind of overt propaganda. In recent decades, they returned in their masses, yes. Pioneers, defiant returnees, and defenders, they made deserts bloom. Propaganda, right? I mean, there were many blooming deserts before, right? Remember that 50% of the citrus was owned by Palestinians, right? Revived the Hebrew language, built villages and towns, and created a thriving community controlling its own economy and culture, loving peace but knowing how to defend itself, bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants, and aspiring towards independent nationhood. Very justice oriented, I gotta say. Very SJW almost, I gotta say. So for all the fucking anti-SJWs that say that pro-Palestinian state arguments is just SJW bullshit. Well, the original fucking SJW seems to be David Ben-Gurion. In the year 5657, 1897, at the summons of the spiritual father of the Jewish state, Theodor Herzl, the first Zionist Congress, convened and proclaimed the right of the Jewish people to national rebirth in its own country. So what is this? What is this right? Proclaim the right? What do you mean by right? What is a right? A natural right? Do you have a natural right to this? Or do you have, a right by international decree, right? By international consensus, right? My guess is, and this guess is going to turn out to be right because I know the contents of this declaration, it's going to be international consensus. And sure enough, this right was recognized in the Balfour Declaration. Wow, you're hiding behind the auspices of an empire? Why would you do that? Oh, that's right, because you want the international community to back you, right? You want geopolitical justice under that rubric. And reaffirmed the mandate of the League of Nations, which in particular gave international sanction. Ooh, really? Really, Adam? No geopolitical justice? Really? Gave international sanction to the historic connection between the Jewish people and Eretz Israel and to the right of the Jewish people to rebuild its national home. Crazy stuff. I wonder how many people making these dumb fuck arguments have even read the Israeli Declaration of Independence. Like do people care about primary sources anymore? Because they could fucking hoodwink, I guess, people that don't read. But if you actually spend some time and read this kind of stuff and you cultivate an actual dispassionate, even emotionally passionate, I guess, interest in this. I have some emotional attachments here. Israel Palestine was actually my first political question that kind of galvanized me. But if you actually read this kind of stuff, you know exactly how ahistorical these modern narratives are. Survivors of the Nazi Holocaust in Europe, as well as Jews from other parts of the world, continue to migrate to Eretz Israel, undaunted by difficulties, restrictions, and dangers, and never cease to assert their right to a life of dignity, freedom, and honest toil in their national homeland. So we're bringing up the Holocaust. Why? Because people feel bad for the Jews. Why shouldn't they? You had a fucking genocide. A third of European Jews died. Clearly, it makes sense. This is the thing that gets me. It makes so much sense, doesn't it? It makes so much sense to make the kind of argument that I'm making, right? To make a geopolitical justice-oriented argument that, hey, it makes sense for Jews to have a homeland because look at these years of pogroms. Look at historically what happened to Jews. Look what happened during the Holocaust. What is the defining feature everywhere there? There is no homeland. There is no monopoly on force. There is no military power. Therefore, Jews can be bullied. Hitler can do whatever he wants to them because there is no organized power protecting them, right? So that's the argument that I would make for why it makes sense to have a state like Israel. Even though long term, eventually Israel is not going to be a Jewish state. I mean, Jews are just too wealthy and politically connected to even fucking have children. You know what I mean? They're just gonna stop having children. Arabs are gonna keep having children. Eventually, we're gonna hit. I think the ultimate projection is 14 billion people on the planet. Jews are going to become an even smaller minority, in terms of proportion, right? So, but Israel as a state, as a thing that would defend Jewish interests, it makes sense. And the only way you could make that argument is through the same kind of geopolitical, justice-oriented arguments that all these anti Palestinian state rights people sort of don't want to make it. They don't want to make it because they want to have their cake and eat it too, right? They want to have the international community back them up. They want to have the Declaration of Independence, but they don't want the responsibilities that implies. So in the Second World War, the Jewish community of this country contributed its full share to the struggle of the freedom and peace-loving nations against the forces of Nazi wickedness, and by the blood of its soldiers and its war effort, gained the right to be reckoned among the peoples who founded the United Nations. Yeah, absolutely. Geopolitical justice makes...
how does David Ben-Gurion know more about the shit than my friend does? I mean, my friend has the benefit of 70 years of living after this fact, right? 75 years after the declaration, he's been alive. Well, not alive, right? But that amount of history, that amount of like, just understanding like where the consensus is, and to just like reject it, I don't know. It's very ahistorical, right? And watch this, baby. On the 29th November 1947, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. The General Assembly required the inhabitants of Israel to take such steps as were necessary on their part for the implementation of that resolution. This recognition by the UN of the right of Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. Oh my goodness. The geopolitical justice has gone so fucking into the SJW direction that David Ben-Gurion is so delusional that he's making appeals to international law. He's making appeals to UN General Assembly resolutions, right? That's how disconnected and uninterested he is in the consensus and in geopolitical justice, right? This recognition by the UN of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. Wow, I wonder if that's the same thought that they have about Resolution 242. That's not irrevocable, right? That's a couple decades after, right? The new anti-Semitism, right? We can't take the UN seriously anymore. We got what we want from the UN. We can't fucking take them seriously anymore. Why? For what? We could do what we want. We're a nuclear armed power. What's the UN going to do, right? We could nuke Palestinians. What are they going to do? Sanction us? I said earlier, like I don't know if nuking is Tony Blinken's, the new Secretary of Defense under Biden. Maybe nuclear war against Palestinian people is Tony Blinken's red line. But he said that if Israel chooses to annex more territory, like they're trying to do with the settlements, we're not gonna like have our military aid to Israel be contingent upon their following of international law, right? This is a fucking liberal internationalist saying this. Accordingly, we, members of the People's Council, representatives of the Jewish community, blah, 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 okay, whatever. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. I wish they followed, right, the safeguards of their own fucking Declaration of Independence. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. Not so sure if that's really how it worked out. It will safeguard the holy places of all religions. Not so sure that that's actually how it played out. And it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the UN. Oh my goodness! It's just like reading this fucking paragraph, like we keep upping the ante, like clause after clause after clause is getting crazier and crazier and more insane, right? Just more and more insane with the safety of hindsight. It's just insane. Oh my goodness, guys. Faithful to the principles of the Charter of the UN. My goodness, are you saying that about UN Resolution 242? We know they're not even saying that about the resolution 29th November 1947, right? Because they're going to ultimately take the green line armistice, right? Lines, right? So even that part is not serious. Watch this. The state of Israel is prepared to cooperate with the agencies and representatives of the UN in implementing the resolution of the General Assembly of the 29th November 1947 and will take steps to bring about the economic union of the whole of Eretz Israel. Don't fucking tell me there is no geopolitical justice in these questions. This whole fucking document is just riding the dick of the international community. And then after you have that dick blow its load, you're going to say, we don't need you anymore. right? Now we're going to give you blue balls for the rest of your life. Like, don't fucking tell me this is not geopolitical justice. This is all that this is about. This is all. Let us couch everything that we want in the language of international liberal hegemony. Everything, fucking everything, everything. Whether it's the appeals to the Holocaust, whether it's the appeals to the political form of Zionism, that was the innovation of Theodor Herzl, right? Whatever they were talking about, like everything here is about that. Everything here is about that. We appeal to the UN to assist the Jewish people in the building up of its state and to receive the state of Israel into the community of nations. Again, don't tell me this shit. You're trying to get everything that you want. You're trying to get everything that you want, right, from the international community. And then you want to reject the consensus when it's no longer useful to you. We appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months to the Arab inhabitants of the state of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all its provisional and permanent institutions. We extend our hand to all neighboring states and their peoples in an offer of peace and good neighborliness, and appeal to them to establish bonds of cooperation and mutual help with the sovereign Jewish people settled in its own land. The state of Israel is prepared to do its share in a common effort for the advancement of the entire Middle East. Oh my goodness. The state of Israel is prepared to do its share. Wow. What does that sound like to you? You know what? Like anybody. Let's just do this last paragraph because this is just. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally. Diaspora is the way that I used to pronounce it when I first started reading books when I was 16 years old. And then ultimately I heard the word diaspora actually verbalized by someone. And then I was like, oh shit, I've been saying diaspora this whole time. And I still say diaspora when I'm reading. We appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Israel in the tasks of immigration and upbuilding, and to stand by them in the great struggle for the realization of the age-old dream, the redemption of Israel. Wow, wow, wow. We have an age-old dream for an age-old, never to be had until now sense for geopolitical justice, right? This is all that this is, okay? This is what this is. The redemption of Israel is the creation of Israel, just like Herzl said, under the rubric of international law, just like David Ben-Gurion said, in international standing, right? Anybody that gives you this dumb fuck argument about international law is bullshit. Israel doesn't have to abide by shit. Well, just ask them if they've ever even fucking read the Declaration of Independence from Israel. And their answer, of course, is going to be no. Because if the answer is yes and they still hold this position, they are fucking hypocrites and there's no reason to take them seriously. The end. Okay, so this concept of Nakba, right? So Nakba is the Arab word that's used for, I guess technically it's like on the day after the Declaration of Independence, where you essentially have like the start of this population transfer. And Nakba means like the disaster, right? So every day it's like May 16th, May 15th, I forget. It's celebrated every year as like Nakba Day, right? I guess it's like a day of mourning. And I mean, this is an important question, right? So was this an ethnic cleansing? This is controversial to say. My feeling is it's controversial to say, not because it's actually truly historically controversial. It's controversial to say because, Israel is ascended. It's a great power. Just like when you talk shit about like American imperialism or whatever, like if you watch that video from 2003 of, or was it 2004 of, what's his name? Michael Moore taking an award for Bowling for Columbine. He talks shit about, in his acceptance speech, he talks shit about the Iraq War, and all these fucking shitlibs are booing him, right? Because like, you know, polite people don't do that, right? They don't politicize an award ceremony. They're fucking giving him like an award for like a political film. We don't want to politicize the Oscars, right? All right. So many great films get honored every year, right? So you know, back then it was controversial to say that about America, right? During the height of Iraq. And today it's controversial to say that about an American ally, right? To say that they engage in ethnic cleansing. And, you know, you have to understand like what like academia in fact is, right? Academia will have its own like set of like mini cottage industries that are there to, you know, they get grants, right? They get funded by the powers that be, right? They get funded by the status quo. They have an interest in maintaining the status quo, which is why even all the, you know, kind of like, you know, Marxist academics or whatever, and all the woke academics that go on their fucking rampages these days, it's all like woke capital bullshit, right? Their existence is for one reason only, right? It's to legitimate what we, you know, see before us. So I think this is probably the best explanation why historically, right, this is still considered controversial to call the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in fact an ethnic cleansing. In the same way that if you look at, you know, history 2 centuries ago, like I'm sure it was controversial to call that an ethnic cleansing, whatever, you know, the language was at the time. Anyway. So this is again from Wikipedia, the concept of transfer in Zionism. So the question is like, you know, what did Zionists in fact intend, right? What did they intend from the native like Palestinian Arab population? Or like, what did they intend to happen to them? And we actually have a rich documentary record, even to this day, right? To this day, we have Israeli politicians talking about a greater Israel, right? Netanyahu clearly wants a greater Israel, right? He wants to fucking annex the settlements, right, and more land, for that matter. So let's just put this further into historical context, though. So from Wikipedia. The discussion of the idea of transfer in political Zionism became popular beginning in the 1980s when Israel declassified documents pertaining to the Arab-Israeli War. And the so-called new historians, people like Benny Morris, people like Avi Shlaim. I still think I have a book by Avi Shlaim here, The Iron... I forget. I read this book like, you know, as a teenager. I still have it. New historians are those that are there too. They're like more liberal, I guess. Although Benny Morris has become like a kind of crazy right winger. He doesn't disavow his books, but when he goes on like Israeli media now, or American media for that matter, he mischaracterizes even like his own like early books. So like Righteous Victims. The origins of the refugee problem or something. Anyway, so at the time, right, we have this like new historians, they're publishing new stuff about the conflict. The Zionist concept of transfer was cited by Palestinian authors such as Nur Masalha and Walid Khalidi to support their argument that the Zionist Yishuv followed an expulsion policy, and echoed by a range of Israeli authors, including Simons and Floppin. Other Israeli historians, such as Benny Morris, reject the idea that transfer thinking led to a political expulsion policy as such, but they explained that the idea of transfer was endorsed in practice by mainstream Zionist leaders, particularly David Ben-Gurion. Critics of the transfer principle theory cite addresses by the Zionist leadership that publicly preached coexistence with the Arabs, but in private put forward their own plans or gave support to plans involving the transfer of Arabs from Palestine. So this is like a big thing, right? From the very beginning, Zionists and David Ben-Gurion, like they want to couch everything in the language of international law and consensus. And then privately, it's like, well, you know, let's do a population transfer. Let's, you know, how do we deal with this problem of, you know, native Palestinians, right? They're gonna be a problem in terms of an ethnically pure, right, Jewish state. The idea that transfer ideology contributed to the Exodus was first brought up by several Palestinian authors and supported by Erskine Childers in his 1971 article, The Wordless Wish.
This was referred to the idea to support his idea that the Yishuv followed an expulsion policy in April and May of 1948. In the 80s, historian Benny Morris became the most well-known advocate of the existence of the transfer idea. According to Morris, while not discounting other reasons for the exodus, the transfer principle theory suggests that this prevalent attitude of transfer is what made it easy for the Jewish population to accept it and for local Haganah and IDF commanders to resort to various means of expelling the Arab population. So Haganah was the it was the so we had Lehi and what was the other one? Lehi and Irgun that they were like flat out terrorist groups. Haganah was kind of like, I guess, the pre IDF paramilitary wing of I mean, they were essentially like they were funded and they were armed explicitly by Britain. So I guess you could say that they're kind of like de facto monopoly of force, military, right? They're not just like a private army engaging, in willy nilly terrorism. Although definitely there's tons of terrorism from the IDF and from Haganah itself. He also notes that the attempt to achieve a demographic shift through Aliyah, Jewish immigration to the land of Israel, had not been successful, right? Because again, I mean, even even in the 1947 partition plan, I mean, within like a decade, they would have been outnumbered. Jews would have been outnumbered already, right? As a result, some Zionist leaders adopted the transfer of a large Arab population as the only viable solution. Morris also points out that if Zionist support for transfer really is unambiguous, the connection between that support and what actually happened during the war is far more tenuous than Arab propagandists, it's a typo, will allow. To this he adds that from April 1948, Ben-Gurion is projecting a message of transfer. There is no explicit order of his in writing. There is no orderly, comprehensive policy, but there is an atmosphere of population transfer. Again, keep in mind that during this time, we've got tons of people fleeing, and just people feeling like this is not my country anymore. The transfer idea is in the air. The entire leadership understands that this is the idea, no doubt. The officer corps understands what is required of them. Under Ben-Gurion, a consensus of transfer is created. And I just want you guys to really take a look at this map, okay? Without even knowing anything else about it. This is the map of modern day Israel. You see this. The line here is the line with Jordan to the east. We have the Jordan River. We have everything that is kind of unoccupied here. That is what is kind of like now known as kind of like the West Bank. Well, I mean not all of it, but I mean large parts of it. And every little dot that you see here, there's over 400 of these on this map. Every single dot that you see here is a Palestinian village or city. Okay? If you look at a modern map of Israel today, it looks like the exact opposite now. All these red dots now have shifted to the West Bank, to this little thing here called the Gaza Strip, and everything that is a red dot here, it is now just Jewish land, right? It is now like Israel proper. Like literally, what happened was all these people that were living there, they were pushed. Either they ended up in Jordan, right? They ended up maybe in some other country, or they ended up in Gaza or the West Bank, right? All these cities, like they're all destroyed. All these villages are destroyed. Like we're talking about mass scale fucking rampages, property destruction. This is literally what happened, okay? This is what happened. Over 400. These things don't exist anymore. Right? They're history. They're done. There was an actual population transfer. There's no way to establish a demographically pure Israel, if by that you mean a predominantly Jewish state, without this happening. You don't have to ensconce transfer under law. You could just fucking do it. especially like under the kind of confusion of war, which ends only in 1949, and by which you suddenly have like 22% extra land because like, oh, that's where that's where the armies were conquered. Um, that happened. Okay, that actually happened. All of this was transferred. So was that an ethnic cleansing? Think about how you would answer that question a century from now. Think about how you would answer that question when it comes to Native Americans. It's not very controversial now, is it? To the extent that it still is kind of controversial, it's, America has like an interest in, not accepting that they committed a genocide, not accepting that they owe something to Native Americans, right? Just like Israel now, because this is such recent history, because those refugees, they're still alive, they still exist. There's a vested interest in pretending like that didn't happen, right? Anybody that says there wasn't a population transfer, show them this fucking map. This was all Arab territory. So, and just quickly, just to go through the 1967 war. After that war was over, it's a war that Israel, I'm not sure if I guess Israel won because it acquired land, right? So UN Resolution 242 demands the withdrawal of Israeli forces from occupied territories as well as total cessation of war by all belligerents. Every relevant Arab state accepted it by 1972. I think I forget what was the last one. Like not every country accepted it right away, right? But eventually every Arab or most Arab states did by that point. So the reason why we have 242 is so after the 1967 war, just like in 1949, where did the armies end up from Israel and the Arab forces? Well, wherever they were like defeated, that became like the green line, and that became de facto like the land grab for Israel. Similar thing happens like less than 20 years later. Okay, there's another war. We have like a ratcheting of tensions, obviously, like because nothing was fucking resolved after 1949, obviously. Ratcheting of tensions. We have 1967 war, and Israel, just as before, it captured new territory. Right? It's occupying these. That's why they're called occupied territories. There's a military occupation in Gaza. There's a military occupation in the Golan Heights. There's a military occupation in the West Bank, and the UN says no. Like, remember Hitler? Right? Remember. Like you came to be as a state in the post World War II order. We said that no land grabs are permissible under law. You have to withdraw. You have to have a Palestinian state. They reiterated their support for a Palestinian state then, and of course, like Israel never truly withdrew. The 2005-6 withdrawal of Ariel Sharon from Gaza is bullshit because it's a withdrawal from a very kind of like it's a small strip of kind of undesirable land in exchange for like ratcheting up like more settlements in the West Bank and taking and like constructing like that Israeli apartheid wall, which very weirdly enough, it seems to like cut through all the best land that is not even, part of 1967, that is not even part of, the Green Line, right? Just to do these like de facto annexations. This is why the World Court said that this is a land grab, that this is an apartheid type system, that this is not legal. UN Resolution 242, let's withdraw, right? And again, like, even at this point, although like Israel is like has been misbehaving now for like 20 years, they still are accepting, at least superficially, the language of the international order, right? So 1968, Israel's ambassador to the UN states, and my guess is if they state this is what Israel is bound by. Quote, "My government has indicated its acceptance of the Security Council resolution for the promotion of agreement on the establishment of a just and lasting peace. I am also authorized to reaffirm that we are willing to seek agreement with each Arab state on all matters included in that resolution." And I don't know why I didn't put this in, but the broad outline of the resolution is we withdraw all Israeli forces and we start doing what we need to do to establish a Palestinian state, not a Cisjordanian state, a Palestinian state, okay? And in 1968, Israel says, okay, fine, we're going to do it. And by the 70s, they're like, no, we're not going to abide by it. Like, so literally within a decade, they're like, you know what? The pressure from the international community is too high right now. It's too hot. And the only way to deal with it is to not deal with it, is to say that we're just not going to abide by what you're asking us to abide by. So when we think about the roots of the conflict, right? I mean, here they are. 1947, an unfair partition as it is. Terrible partition plan, right? Unfair. We know that now. 1949, the actual partition as it stood functionally turned out to be even more unfair, right? So that's a problem. 1967, we have a furtherance of this, right? We have more land being captured. And still, to this day, we don't have an actual end to the occupation. Not just the military occupation, but just like getting rid of those fucking illegal settlements. Like, they literally should not exist, right? They just should not exist. And I mean, look, Israel can't do this, right? It can't keep like accepting on the one hand the international consensus, which is Israel has a right to exist, right? And we're going to fund you. We're going to give you the soft power that comes with having a state. We're going to give you the military power that comes with being a state, and the kind of, broad, legal leeway and doing whatever kind of crazy shit that you want to do, as a state actor. You can't do that and accept that. And then on the other hand, say, I, Israel, after getting those wide benefits from the international community, I'm going to renege and abdicate my responsibilities as a state actor, right? You can't do that. One of your responsibilities is you have to abide by UN resolutions, and you're not, right? So roots of the conflict, I would say there, just very briefly going into Taba, going into Camp David. Again, my friend Adam, when we first met, this was how our arguments started. He was very adamant that, we would have had a Palestinian state if in Camp David and Taba, Palestinians didn't demand a right of return that ultimately would have just caused demographic collapse. Like, he was saying that, Palestinians wanted to send 1 million or 2 million, 3 million, 4 million Palestinians into Israel proper, which when you actually look at what the diplomatic record is, what the actual documentary record is, what people like Brzezinski said was going on and transpired during Camp David and Taba. What happened was Ehud Barak, at the time, Labor was the peace party, just like Democrats and Republicans today. Like Democrats used to be the Labor Party, right? And Labor also in Israel used to be the Labor Party, but 80s, 90s, just like everywhere else. These kind of FDR-esque sort of parties, they started losing support to this other kinds of, I guess, conservatives. Like the neoliberal order had to be refashioned, so they had no actual relationship with labor. In the 90s, I think the last major union in Israel, I forget the name of it, but it kind of withdrew its support, and it was a big employer in Israel in the 90s. So labor at that point, it was pigeonholed into, okay, we're no longer the party of Ben-gurion, because Ben-gurion was labor, right? So we don't really have that connection to him anymore, because it's been many years. Just like Democrats today have no actual connection to FDR, right? That's our kind of GOAT, right? Greatest of all time. Just like David Ben-gurion was labor's GOAT for a while. So they're okay, we're gonna be at least the Labor Party, right? And eventually, of course, neoliberal agendas all around the world. Suddenly, okay, we can't be the Labor Party anymore, so we are now going to be the Peace Party. And Ehud Barak, right? He had an election coming up, shortly. It was going to be shortly after the the negotiations, and he actually won his election. So he said, "Fuck it, I don't need to do this shit anymore. I don't need to pretend like I give a fuck about peace." Right? He could have easily from the get go just said, we're just gonna destroy all these settlements, right? Because they're not legal. They're an impediment to peace. They're actually a security concern for us. Like, it's great for, Arab propaganda against Israel. It's great for anti-Semitism that everybody in the world can say, haha, look at Israel, right? They are doing this kind of massive violation of human rights. So he just ducked out. When it comes to the question of the refugee crisis, what Palestinians actually said, the high-end estimates that I saw were 250,000 Palestinians in a country with a couple of million Jews. That is not a demographic collapse by any stretch, right? And that's just the high end, right? Arafat at some point, if you trust some of these diplomats, said 100,000. Some numbers I saw as low as 10,000, right? Just to have this kind of nominal, because another part of 242 is you want a just resolution, right, to the refugee question. And that's deliberately left vague so that Israel and Palestinians could sort of decide for themselves what that looks like. Is it every Palestinian refugee? Well, functionally, that's never been the case. That has always been a non-starter. It was never going to be all Palestinian refugees have a right to return to their original land. It was going to be, let's keep the language so that nominally we could at least get this kind of recognition from Israel that yes, there was an ethnic cleansing, and yes, there were refugees, and yes, there is some kind of obligation that Israel has to these people. We have that. But on the other hand, there needs to be some kind of return, right? Even if it's 10,000, even if it's 100,000, even if it's 250,000. And, that is not a non-starter. If Israel says that, sorry, if 250,000 or 100,000 or 500,000 Palestinians is too much for Israel to absorb, but that's a non-starter to them, they have to explain how, in the international consensus that they claim to accept in 1947, in 1949, in 1967, they have to accept why, during these negotiations, Arabs have to continually give them not just Israel's legal due, because Israel already got way more than its legal due, but to even negotiate away Palestinians' own legal due. Because again, remember, under international law, Palestinians have a right to return. It is up to Palestine and Israel how to adjudicate that, fine. But they have some kind of right of return. Whether that's 10,000 plus massive compensation, whether that's 500,000 or less compensation. That is the obligation of Israel under the law. We're already starting with Israel getting more than it's due. And still, again, trying to nickel and dime and chip away what Israel, what Palestinians deserve, right? So anyway, as far as the roots, we have to deal with that, right? Taba and Camp David collapsed because Barack wanted it to collapse. And because on some level, I guess Israel never wanted to even admit a nominal 10,000, refugees to return. Even nominally, they don't want to admit any kind of wrongdoing because, we're Jews, right? We're supposed to be the ancestral victims that have now been sort of, ordained by God to sort of, have this super powerful state because of our, thousands of years of victimization. So, if you have no admission of reality, you cannot get to an actual, peace that is sustained, right? That's just pretty basic. And just to, I guess, finish this up, is there such a thing as geopolitical justice? Well, okay, to go back to my friend Adam, he says no. I said yes, and I said yes because the clearest example of geopolitical justice is the existence and the formation of Israel, right? But here's a kind of more interesting question. Okay, so even if we concede that in that sense geopolitical justice exists, then we could point to Israel as an example of such. Is it true geopolitical justice in the sense that, well, Israel got its legal due and more, and these other people didn't, right? These other people like Israel got it at the expense of someone else. So is that geopolitical justice for Israel? Like, you could adjudicate the question that way, but what you cannot do, right, is say that there is no geopolitical justice purely on one side here, because Israel did get what it wanted. It did use the language of the international community, and then to tackle this final question, is this a simple free rider problem? Answer is yes. Like, they from Herzl to David Ben-Gurion to even like 1968, with that ambassador said about 242. They're getting so much, right, from the international community. They're getting recognition, immediate recognition from the superpowers, right? They're getting the kinds of emotions that were raw, like, after the Holocaust, and they're getting this kind of pity, international pity, which, by the way, of course, like, Israelis never wanted that, right? Like, tons of Holocaust survivors went to Israel, and they were discriminated against as late as the 2000s, right? Maybe, I don't know how many Holocaust survivors are still alive in Israel, but there were like straight up like protests organized by and on the behalf of Holocaust victims, right? Holocaust survivors in Israel, because they were living in poverty, because they were neglected by Israelis, because Israel wants to fucking forget them. And the reason why Israel wanted to forget the survivors of the Holocaust is, the whole kind of like national idea, right, behind Israel is, we're not victims. We're going to take what we want. We're not going to depend on anyone. We're going to take what we want. We're going to do it in military fashion because that's the way that it's been to us. And if you are a survivor of the Holocaust, why didn't you go out there and resist during the Holocaust? You must have been a collaborator with the Nazis, weren't you? That's why you were able to survive. So for years, right, as late as the 2000s, Israeli survivors of the Holocaust are facing discrimination, are facing poverty, unemployment, are facing like the same kinds of fucking problems, essentially, that like the Vietnam War that's facing America today. Homelessness. Oh my goodness. Is there a place for them in Israel, right? So finally, like, is this a free rider problem? Because we're co-opting the language of the Holocaust without actually wanting to do enough for Holocaust victims, that these fucking like decrepit ass like senior citizens are not willing to go out and protest how they're being treated by Israelis. But we're still going to co-opt, the language of the Holocaust when we do our Declaration of Independence, and when we do all of our kind of like present day propaganda as to why Palestinians don't deserve a state and we do. We're going to co-opt the language of international unity, of international law, of international rubrics, of international everything, consensus, whatever. And after we get what we want, we're going to become free riders. I mean, like, is it really that simple? It might be just as simple as that, right? We just have a basic free rider problem when it comes to Israel and Palestine. Who are the free riders? The free riders are Israel in this case. So, roots of the problem, 1947. Forget 49 for a second. 1947 has not been fairly and properly adjudicated. Okay? Who even knows about 1947 now? Who knows about the differences between 1947 and 1949 versus 1967? Like, none of that has been adjudicated. Those are the roots. The roots are, we had a bunch of people that were living in Palestine. We have a bunch of other people that, for right reasons or wrong reasons, we don't even have to take a position. We can even concede that these are the right reasons. We can even concede that Jews, after the Holocaust and after everything else, deserve a state in Palestine. But if you're going to make that argument, and if you make that argument, fine. If you want to make that argument, you have to also answer the question of what happens to Palestinians. If the answer is they only get 20% of the land, I'm sorry, you deserve the fucking like instability that creates. If you say they get all the shit and they don't even get a state, I'm sorry, but you deserve the consequences of that. I mean, like, it's like the same shit about like victim blaming. Like, when people say like, oh, you're blaming the victims. Listen, when I was growing up,
I used to like, I was like very kind of like, hip hop esque. I used to love wearing like fucking like gold chains and jewelry and shit as a teenager. And I knew there were certain places that I couldn't fucking go, right? I couldn't, like, there's some neighborhoods that you should not go into with a gold chain around your neck. Not because you deserve what you get, in that kind of sense. I mean, there's like a law, right? You don't deserve to get mugged, but it's like, what's going to happen. I mean, what goes on. Why would you like go into this neighborhood, that neighborhood wearing a gold chain? Well, same question here. Why would you make a fucking partition plan that gives Palestinians the worst land, despite the fact that they're the overwhelming majority? Why would you create a partition plan that creates a de facto refugee crisis? Why would you then abide the 1949 Green Line armistice lines that gives Palestinians even less land? Why are you as a nation saying by the 70s that you don't care about UN Resolution 242 after, giving lip service to international law? In that sense, don't you like as a like a macro state actor, not as like an individual, right? Obviously individuals never deserve like fucking, to die, right? To get hurt, right? We have laws. But you as a state, like, don't you fucking like deserve like what you sow in that sense? I mean, like these are the roots of the problem, isn't it? Like the and on top of this, like it's not as if you're even like reaping what you sow all that much. I mean, like really, what are Israel's security concerns right now? Like if you're living in Israel, the murder rate, which includes terrorism, the murder rate in Israel right now is 2.5 for every 100,000. Okay. The murder rate in America is 5 for every 100,000. So if you're living in America and you look at Israel and you're like, my goodness, look at all these existential threats that, Israeli civilians face. Well, honestly, if you just move your ass from America to Israel, you cut your chances of getting murdered by all causes, including terrorism, in half, right? You cut those chances in half. That's the reality. So, to the extent that Israel is like, reaping what it sows. I mean, it's not going to reap any true like existential threat in terms of like military concerns. I mean, like they have fucking nukes, right? I mean, why do you think North Korea still exists, right? They have nukes. So that's not a question. I think long term, what Israel has to face is the fact that like young Jews in the United States right now, like they don't give a fuck about Israel, right? They don't have a personal affinity there. And the whole international community, like for decades now, they're like, this is an injustice. This is against the law. And everybody knows this. So like Israel is this kind of like de facto pariah state. Okay. Long term, if Israel doesn't solve its issues by like, in America, by signaling that we're okay with the Palestinian state according to pre-1967 green line borders, it's gonna have its own fucking demographic collapse. Like you're gonna have to do eventually a one state solution. Like if you don't want a 2-state solution, you're gonna get a 1-state solution. So I know I uploaded that other video where Finkelstein is making fun of BDS and I'm making fun of BDS, whatever. But the reason why like BDS is this kind of like overcompensation where they're kind of implicitly favoring a 1-state solution is it doesn't come from nowhere. It's not like a random like thing that they just did, right? It comes from the fact that Israel and America keep rejecting a 2-state solution. They just are. And the demographic problem is only going to get worse. It just is. So if you're going to reject a two-state solution, and if you're going to end up with a de facto 1-state solution, whether or not you like it, then, BDS is just kind of, accelerationists in that sense, aren't they, right? They're just kind of accelerating the inevitable by, doing their own kind of, style of propaganda or whatever. They're trying to like circumvent the international community because it seems like everybody's trying to circumvent the international community after paying it lip service. And if you don't want a 2-state solution, you're going to end up with one, right? These are the consequences of being a free rider. Sorry.
I mean, there's nothing else to say. This is my spiel on it. I said this was going to be 1 hour, maybe two. We did this for almost 3 hours. I hope you guys enjoyed this part of the stream. I actually didn't eat yet. I'm going to take a little break. I'll be back with you guys to do everything else in the description. So thank you for watching. If you're just watching now, if you haven't hit like or subscribe, please hit like and subscribe. Tons of content. I try to do these things every week. Arts, politics, from perspectives, and at a kind of depth that you don't see anywhere else, I don't think. So thanks for watching. I will be back shortly.